Everyone, and welcome all PCAST members, members of the public to this September meeting of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Remember, this meeting is being live streamed and to the public, and it's being recorded. The recording of this session will be available by next week on the PCAST website. We're thrilled to be in Detroit today, and we thank our host, Michigan Central, and we also thank those speakers who are coming in from the West Coast in our first session, Steve Armato in Seattle. Thank you very much. So today we'll be discussing transportation innovation in 3 public sessions, and we all have to get around after all, and what better place to talk about transportation than Motown? And this first section will focus on the future of transportation, including envisioning what transportation could become, the challenges that need to be overcome to achieve that vision, and the need for transportation research and how AI can be leveraged to improve safety. Importance of supply chain as part of the ecosystem. Second session will explore infrastructure planning and implementation, including an overview of federal decarbonization efforts, technical challenges and insights required for planning and implementation, and at the state level, and strategies for optimizing public transportation from a city perspective. Finally, in the third session, we'll concentrate on transportation innovation. Activities of organizations here in Michigan. We'll discuss the state of autonomous vehicle research and deployment, research to support the future of transportation from industry perspective, and translating R&D innovations into opportunities here in Detroit. So it should be a lot of fun. So here we are on the session. Let's get started. We've asked the panelists to each provide very brief remarks of 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion following their presentations. Remember, turn off your videos, microphones muted, and PCAST members, please remember to put up your cards when you want to speak. Those on video, please put together, please use your hand raise function for that. And now I'll introduce our 3 speakers for this session. Remember, longer biographical information is available on the PCAST website and in the members' agenda books. We have Kara Kockelman with us, who's a professor of transportation engineering at the University of Texas, Austin. Ben Levine, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Steve Armato is Vice President of Amazon Transportation Services, Product and Technology at Amazon. Please, Ms. Kockelman, you can start your presentation.
Thanks so much, but no video, I guess. So I will turn that off.
And you can have your video on, Kara.
Indeed, Kara, we'd love to have your video.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to replace your slides with mine. And I'm going to have to move this menu bar up so it doesn't get in the way with what I'm seeing. Well, I really appreciate your having me here today. It's quite a privilege, and I'm going to be brief because we need to be brief, so you'll hear me speaking quickly, but there are 3 big takeaways. One is that electric vehicles can really help us. Autonomous vehicles have both benefits and some serious downsides to be aware of, and there are lots of existing and well understood technologies and policies that can be helping us right now and really could have been adopted years ago, like we see in many of our peer nations. So Americans spend a lot on transportation because it's extremely valuable to us in terms of our time investment. That's the biggest piece of it. And if you average it out, assuming $20 per hour per person, some people have much higher values of time and willingness to save time, and others have lower. But it works out to almost $10,000 per person per year in this country across 340 million people. And the next big thing is ownership of those rolling assets. So those are cars and trucks, and that's about $4,000 per year per person in this country just to own and park that vehicle in front of your home, for example, on average. And those is crash costs. I'm sure some of you have never been in a crash, but those of us who have, and I've been in several over my lifetime, it is really problematic when it happens, even if there is no injury involved, which I've been fortunate to not have. But pain and suffering and other members of the household chipping in and, delays to other motorists on the road, that ends up being almost as much as simply owning the vehicle. So those are much higher than most people would have ever guessed. Congestion pales in comparison to this. And congestion's already rolled into that 9,000. It's about $1,000 per year if you want to pull it out. Fuel, almost as much, and this is only by conventional vehicles. Of course, those with electric vehicles are probably paying quite a bit less. Only $100, by the way, of that fuel is gas tax, which people seem to have a really hard time raising, which is kind of embarrassing given that we pay less for this hazardous material than anybody in the world, except for the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, where the governments control the access to that resource. So this is, something that's much less than a lot of Americans would lead you to believe. Depending on what you drive, of course, it can vary. And then there's the carbon emissions. And if you want to assume $100 per ton, which a lot of experts are recommending, given how close we are to numerous tipping points, how quickly this has escalated. And the wildfires that we're seeing, not just the shorelines and flooding issues, as well as the incredible winters with the polar vortexes coming down, staying here in Texas longer, messing up grid and other investments. That is I think higher than many people would guess. It's rivaling the cost of gasoline. And then there's other emissions. So NOx is a precursor to fine particulate matter, that kind of thing. And then there's noise and visual blight. There's habitat and species loss. There's fear of walking and biking, which is causing a lot of problems, especially since we do lead such sedentary lifestyles. And so that is not something I think we would like to continue. So we are really envious of our peer nations in that regard. And I've been working in this arena for about 30 years. So my students do incredible work. And one of the pictures I have here is just a shared autonomous all-electric vehicle doing first mile, last mile service to the 5 red line stations we have here in Austin. And of course, we do this on a much bigger scale. We've done it for 20 counties across Chicago region and 10 counties across Dallas-Fort Worth. And we normally work at a 6-county scale. This was just a very focused piece of work, and that can show you some of the details of the address locations on origins and destinations as you get to and then leave from those train stations. We do a lot of land use forecasting. So in the lower middle, you're seeing suburban single-family detached housing units, very homogeneous, not a mixed use that we see in a lot of the nations and cities that we envy because of their ability to get so much done simply by biking and walking. On the lower border, you'll see the micro-simulation of individual vehicles that have different acceleration properties. And there we were just trying to figure out what would be the best size, because the smaller size self-driving vehicles will allow for a much higher frequency of transit service along that corridor. And they are more nimble, but of course there are more of them. So they're coming in and out of traffic a little bit more often. And so we're trying to get the real dynamics of traffic there. But we also work at very large scales, like you see the map of the US counties there, and we simulate trade, not just passenger travel, but we also do international travel for passengers. So that's why you have an airplane, although that's also very popular for domestic trip making. And in the lower right, you see just a little picture of some recent pedestrian crash work across the state of Texas, but those are the hot spots for downtown Austin near our river. So we work at many different scales, many different forecasting, fleet forecasting, land use and location choice forecasting, welfare, and emissions, as well as safety. So newer technologies, which is what they asked me to focus on, can have lots of benefits, but also real downsides. So the all electric or battery only electric vehicles, coupled with a much smarter grid, which would include just simple V1G rather than vehicle to grid, but just managing that power provision to the electric vehicles, can really protect the grid. And we have papers on that, as well as the emissions and investment cost implications of that across the nation. So it allows us to use cleaner feedstocks more thoughtfully, like the sun and the wind, depending on when they are available. And if you really invest in that and you shift us entirely for our ground transportation on public roadways, that would end up being about 90% fewer damages, and the grid can handle it. So many people have demonstrated this, many of the best grid modelers and experts in the nation. And that's worth about $1,000 per person per year. Full automation of vehicles brings lots of crash benefits, $2,500 per year. It won't get rid of all crashes. People still make mistakes walking and biking, and of course, cars can still make mistakes. And so the trees fall down in front of you. There's always reasons to crash that have nothing to do with you or other people traveling on that corridor with you. And then there's the lower perceived time cost for those who were previously driving, which is a real benefit. So a couple $1,000s there. But full automation makes driving even easier than it already is in this country. And so we do expect gridlock in many downtowns. We do expect more distant land uses, so people living further from their destinations, maybe sleeping on their way to work, that kind of thing. And depending on the drivetrain decisions, possibly more emissions because of that added vehicle miles traveled, even as our fuel economy goes up on conventional vehicles slowly, very slowly, too slowly over time in this country. And so our results suggest that things like credit-based congestion pricing, empty driving limitations, really strict empty driving limitations on those self-driving vehicles, and then right-sized shared autonomous vehicles. So we call these SAVs, and that means like a mini bus. You can basically have it serve as a form of on-demand transit. So the vehicles turn off when they're not in use, unlike conventional buses where there is a paid driver on a standard 8-hour shift, and he or she is just going to keep going without anybody in the back of that bus or train. So I, always highly recommend electric bikes for those who, would rather not pedal too much or have hills. Those are pretty difficult. Of course, rain is a real problem, so you still need some backups, and incredible heat or snow is also a problem. Although I do think in Finland, they clear the bike paths before they clear the car paths of snow in the winter, which is fantastic. And then there's the shared EV ride subsidy. So right now, Uber and Lyft have EVs in their fleets, and of course, Waymo and Cruise, and now Nuro and others are all electric. And so those can be just subsidized versus spending about $2 per person mile on our conventional transit systems. That's not including the value of time of those travelers or anything. That is practically the subsidy that we are giving every transit user in this country. So that's a lot more than you and I spend on our own vehicles. But of course, we're doing the driving and we manage a lot of the maintenance and other issues. There's upzoning, which you may have noticed in California in a big way under Gavin Newsom a few years ago, and then Minneapolis upzoned to 3 units permitted basically on any single family lot in that city. So the rest of us could really be doing that. We could also be charging the full cost of our use of the roadways. We're paying just like 1 or 2 cents per mile, maybe 3 cents per mile in Texas. And of course, they're now having to have the public go vote on big bond issues to make up for that deficit because the legislators are not willing to raise that gas tax in over 30 years now. And our own emissions, depending on what you drive, it can be very polluting. And so those might range from 1 to 10 cents per mile that we're imposing on other people's lungs. Or you could just put a tube, I guess, from the tailpipe back into the passenger compartment. But I think people would rather design around having to breathe their own emissions directly in their compartment. And there's parking that has been long underpriced. So our peer countries already require auto braking for pedestrians, and even at night, which is not easy, I have to say, but it is something that we should be scoring and we should be highlighting for potential buyers of all vehicles. And my vehicle's never auto braked. I'm not sure yours has, though. Supposedly, it's already standard on 90% or 95% of makes and models sold here in this country, but I'm not seeing it happen. And the speed limitation, it's always been stunning to many of us that our vehicles are permitted to go so fast, even though it's really illegal on any public roadway, and we're not paying for private track use. So I'm not sure what that's good for, except dying. in very, very horrendous crashes. Maybe it's our kids, our teenagers doing it, or maybe it's us in a moment of weakness. Simple tagging of all new vehicles sold in this country, those are 25 cents. They can go in your windshield or they can go under the vehicle, but a lot of people, may tamper with their license plates, and those are a lot harder to read in many settings. There's automated speed enforcement that's happening all over the world and in New York, a little bit in California, maybe now in Phoenix, but really minimal in this country, and a lack of enforcement, right, by police who are being tasked with other duties to keep them away from these kind of potentially dangerous interactions with drivers. There's dongles. These are like $20 things that can read the GPS positioning, or you could have people read their odometers and send you a video. It's not that difficult, and it's pretty enforceable and untamperable. And then there's reg fees and sales taxes by size of your vehicle, or the emissions levels, mobility
Thank you,
wallets
Cara.
for all sorts of transit opportunities. And yeah, this is happening all around the world, except very rarely here in this country. So we are lagging. And
Okay, we need to, okay, great.
I will let you go. Thank you
you.
so much. I look forward to our discussion.
You've given us a lot to discuss. We'll now move to the second speaker, and that's Ben Levine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen here as well. So just bear with me for a moment. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right.
Ben, we're seeing your screen share version, not the presentation version.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just a moment. Are you still seeing my screen share?
Not seeing your screen at all.
Okay.
Now we see your desktop.
Okay, we're getting there. You can see my icons. Apologies for the issues here. Okay. I think this should be good. Now
Yes.
I think we're good. Okay, thank you. Eating into my time. All right. So I'm going to provide a few key items here, and then and then obviously defer time for Q&A. So I'll talk a little bit about federal R&D in transportation and how that relates to other kind of maybe like sectors like energy and health. I'm going to talk about DOT's R&D budget or portfolio, and what are some of the examples of projects that we do support. And then finally, I'm going to finish with some snippets into kind of a case study for an aspirational R&D concept that I helped put together for the White House AI Aspirations Conference that was organized by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I think that will give kind of a perspective into the types of large-scale R&D efforts that might be possible in the transportation space and stewarded by the Department of Transportation. So I hope you can see the details of this slide, but I'll also talk through them. In this slide, you see in blue the total R&D spending by federal and state governments. These figures are from 2019, so they're a bit outdated, but I think recent figures are similar. And you'll see that transportation R&D spending is actually less than $1 billion in 2019, compared to much higher numbers in health and energy. And when you compare those R&D numbers, public R&D numbers, to the GDP or the contribution to GDP of those sectors, you'll see that in health and energy, we invest more than 10 times in R&D relative to those sectors' contribution to the economy. So the overall takeaway here is that maybe unlike energy, transportation is not investing in R&D at the same scale at the government level. Now, there's a lot of R&D happening in the private sector, and you may see some of this during your visit in Detroit. The private sector is investing more than $50 billion in R&D in automotive and aircraft manufacturing. And so there is more than 50 times the R&D going into vehicles as there is in infrastructure. And so this chart's a picture of the R&D spend at the U.S. Department of Transportation for our approximately $1 billion R&D budget. You can see about half of it goes to the Federal Aviation Administration, and another 20% or so goes to federal highways. So the overall takeaway here is, this DOT is not investing or is not considered a R&D agency in the same way as other agencies across the federal government, but we are doing the best we can with the resources we have. And I'll give some examples of what that looks like and kind of the blend of research versus development versus regulatory support that those projects look like. So an example from the Federal Aviation Administration is on sustainable aviation fuel, which is a big area of R&D, certainly in the private sector as well. Federal Highway Administration doing research on the impacts and effectiveness of different treatments on complete streets. So what types of safety interventions affect behavior, and how do we feed that into the guidance and recommendations that we offer as a department? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which regulates vehicles, developing driver alcohol detection technology. And we have a University Transportation Centers program, which is a bit less than $100 million a year that is spread across 35 different centers, including 140 universities, or more than 140 universities. I think you'll be seeing some of the work at University of Michigan that is affiliated with one of our University Transportation Centers. But here's one example at Clemson University, who's our lead on cyber, on doing simulations for cyber threats within the transportation sector. So I hope that overview just sort of provides some context. Then I'll jump in quickly here on this concept, AI for transportation safety projects, mapping, visualizing, and building the future. And so we focused in this example of a project, and I should say this is aspirational. This is not something that DOT is actively doing now. It's something we've been talking about as a possible idea. We are doing pieces of this across our technology and R&D portfolio, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But one of the big issues in transportation, which you'll hear about, I think, over and over again today, is the safety crisis. We over the past 3 years, we've lost more than 40,000 people annually to roadway fatalities. And so the concept that we presented is really, how do you think about digitizing or creating a digital representation of our physical infrastructure? And how could that unlock an ecosystem of innovation where participants from the private sector, from academic institutions, from startups can contribute scalable applications and approaches that can affect state and local agencies across the country? And just kind of quickly here, on the left, you have a representation of an intersection that has a lot of complex uses. I won't go into all of them, but you can see all the different modes of travel, the context of the travel, parks, street level commerce, traffic signals, all these things that exist in a typical intersection. This one, the design is actually quite orderly, but I think the uses would be similar for many different intersections. If you went to a typical transportation agency and asked them to look at a typical intersection, their digital representation would look more like this: roadway center lines, location of fatal and non-fatal crashes, and average daily traffic volumes. And this creates significant challenges for transportation planners at the state and local level to address anything from intersection safety, where it's very hard to prioritize projects on a network scale and then even know what interventions are feasible when you drill down to the specific locations of where you might have particular concerns. Or if you're looking at rural crashes, where the indication of a crash, which is kind of the way that we predominantly respond to safety issues, does not necessarily reflect the underlying risk of a system, because there are low volume events that might just like not that might be rare, but not we might miss dangerous intersections where crashes haven't yet occurred. And so in this concept, we contemplated, well, what would a system look like where we could really have a better digital representation of our physical infrastructure, where we know where roadway lanes are, the width of the lanes, how many lanes there are. We know the average daily traffic, or the vehicle volumes by the day of the week, by hour of the day, turning movements, locations of traffic signalization. systems. We know dedicated use such as transit or parking. We would know where bike facilities are located, what their level of protection is, the usage across those facilities on different days of the week, different hours of the day, and similar information for pedestrian infrastructure, and also including accessibility, crosswalks, curb cuts. We know more information about crashes like near misses or hard braking. And then finally, we'd know the context in which the infrastructure is built, like land use zoning, future growth expectations, elevation, tree canopy, and so forth. And so what we kind of proposed was this idea of a National Transportation Infrastructure Observatory. And we believe that new technologies, including AI, can help us develop this kind of geospatial database of both infrastructure and usage. And I can talk more about the specific approaches that we think that would enable, but also the capabilities, which I'll finish here on this slide. I'm going to skip over privacy and data, even though they're very important, and I can talk about them during Q&A. I don't know, Laura, if
We
I have
need
it.
to wrap up.
Okay, so if there's interest, I can talk about kind of what use cases we could build upon this concept. So thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. And now we'll move to Steve Armato. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here. Can everyone see and hear me well?
Yep, you
And
sound
Ben, you
great.
can go off video.
So I'm Steve Armato. I lead Amazon's transportation technology and services team. It's great to be here today. So I've got 4 sections of my quick presentation. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Then I'll give you an overview of how we've built up Amazon's fulfillment, transportation networks, and our supply chain, recent problems and opportunities we've been tracking, and then how we're thinking about the future. So I've been with Amazon for over 22 years. I started as a software engineer. So I'm a technologist and builder at heart. And I've been part of scaling every aspect of our operations. I started out working in our fulfillment software team, and we had 5 fulfillment centers back then, and now hundreds today. I worked in supply chain optimization technologies for over a decade. That's optimizing how we source and distribute our inventory, predictively placing it close to customers to optimize for speed, cost, and sustainability. And over the last 7 years, I've been working on scaling our transportation operations. So that ranges from the Amazon Smile trailers that you probably see on the highways, to the vans that you see in our neighborhoods, delivering the packages with things that we need and we want. So a quick overview of how we've built up our network. We started with a few central fulfillment centers, as I mentioned, 5 about 22 years ago. And we've gradually expanded to get closer to customers and add shipping and storage capacity. So today, many of these sites leverage robotics and other collaborative technologies. And we've seen technology can create a safer and more ergonomic workplace. We've expanded our fulfillment center topology and volume, and that's given us opportunities for density and optimization. So one early example is, as we built density, we were able to collaborate with other carrier partners to consolidate our package volume and inject into local delivery hubs. And this led us to build out sort centers in our trucking network. And of course, we've scaled our delivery network as well. Those are the vans that you see in your neighborhood with the big smile. And the big themes that we've focused throughout scaling are safety, cost, and speed. And at every step of the way, we've leveraged technology to scale and optimize so that it has several applications: visibility, standardization, centralizing decision-making with algorithms. And by taking this approach, it leads to an important theme that I'll touch on later, agility. So that agility lets us re-optimize and reroute our network in the face of a disruption. And we can also optimize these algorithms over time to further improve cost, speed, and sustainability. So that's a good segue into recent developments in our supply chain. So as you all know, we're operating in a globalized supply chain, and disruptions are increasingly common. And that's, again, where technology and agility can come in. In the face of a disruption, we need to be able to have our network adapt, ideally automatically, preferring dynamic real-time decisions over static decisions, and leveraging algorithms and optimizations to make those decisions, usually in real time. As an example, we've built out our global logistics network for imports. We've been increasing the number of ports of entry that we use so that we can reroute as needed if there's a disruption. We also work closely with many partners, ocean carriers, ports, terminals, drayage drivers, and equipment providers, collectively driving efficiency and productivity. Another recent development for us, lost my notes, sorry, is regionalization. So with regionalization, as our network has grown, we've seen that we can basically divide the US and other countries into a number of regions and then totally rework the network infrastructure so that the fulfillment centers closest to each customer are the ones primarily serving those customers. A big part of getting that right was being able to predictably place inventory near the customer. And again, to use that agility to rework our network infrastructure rather than it being a multiple year project, it was basically multiple months. And that's led to pretty remarkable results. In March, we announced that about 60% of Prime customer orders were delivered same day or next day in the top 60 metropolitan areas. So it's really changed the way that people can get the goods that they need. We're excited about robotics. And in fact, we're the world's largest manufacturer of industrial robotics. And we now have over 750,000 robots deployed. We continue to invest in robotics and collaborative technology. For example, robotics can help with heavy lifting or reducing walking, so our employees can focus on their value-added activities. In addition to improving safety, we also see that robotics and other technologies are creating new job opportunities, and I'll touch on that later, through higher earnings power with those new jobs and job opportunities and job types and upskilling. So we've introduced 700 new job categories as we've introduced these technologies to our network. So the last section, as we look to the future. So it's hard to predict the future, but one sort of North Star that we use is what is always going to be true in the future. So for us at Amazon, we're focused on the customer. And that means that we need to think about what are they going to want 10, 20, 30 years from now. And we're pretty confident they're always going to want the speed, convenience, low prices, and selection. And that gives us clarity. I think as we all think about the future, it's important to think about those North Stars of what will always be true. It reduces the need to guess. So in terms of emerging technologies that we're really excited about, I mentioned robotics. AI, machine learning, and generative AI is obviously a big part of our DNA. We've actually been working with AI and machine learning for over 20 years, starting in areas such as personalization and forecasting. We're really thrilled about generative AI, and we see it as the next big wave of innovation. It's going to be as big as networking and PCs and the internet each were. So we're already integrating it across every aspect of our operations, and I'll give you a couple of categories. There was a lot of discussion in earlier presentations about traffic patterns. We're applying generative AI to help avoid congestion and manage traffic patterns within our robotics fleet. We're also excited about generative AI for prescriptive analytics. So imagine you can combine a knowledge base on any domain with a set of real-time metrics and have it produce insights for us to act on. The next example is quality auditing at scale. So Amazon has a vast product catalog, rich images, hundreds of millions of products. We also have package data about billions of packages that we ship. And so we can combine computer vision with that vast catalog with generative AI to then audit packages before they're sealed and they ship to proactively detect waste and damages. And so that's great for customer, it's great for costs, it's great for sustainability. Another category, a couple more, Internet of Things. So some folks mentioned like GPS dongles, for example. We're excited about large and small Internet of Things. So things from tracking labels to telematics and GPS in our vehicles. So that helps with visibility, which then drives better measurements, and then that lets us optimize. And so those metrics are really important for how we optimize transportation. And as the cost per unit of those devices goes down, it's really promising and exciting what we can do. Safety technology, it was great to see some of the other presenters hit on safety tech. So in 2024 alone, we're investing $750 million in safety initiatives, things from in-vehicle cameras and telematics in our fleet, which we've seen to dramatically improve traffic safety, to driver aids, such as lane keeping, emergency braking, and blind spot detection. So we all value that in our consumer vehicles, I'm sure, and it's great for our fleet as well. And then as I close, two cross-cutting ones that are really important for us. Upskilling. It's really important that our workforce of today and for the future is prepared as these technology trends come into place. And so we've been using upskilling for years now. We have Career Choice, which is available to 750,000 employees globally, offers them on-the-job learning skills and upskilling, prepaid tuition, et cetera. And we also have training for the general public. One example is AI Ready, which pledges to upskill with the general public with free AI skills for up to 2 million people globally in the next year alone. So we're also creating an opportunity with up to $12 million of generative AI scholarships for underrepresented communities. And finally, sustainability and decarbonization is really important to us. And we're committed to creating a delivery fleet that helps us reach our net zero carbon emission goal by 2040. So thanks for the time, and that's all.
Thank you very much, Steve. We'll now open this for discussion, and please raise your cards if you have a question. And I see
Do you like us to
that
stay on camera?
I think all three of you can come on camera now, all three speakers. And I can't see everybody in the room, so please point if, okay, great. So I think Terry and Laura and Paula.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. So my question, sorry, okay. I guess my question, my question is, I guess for all three of you, but maybe Kara in particular. It's about the transition from human-driven vehicles to autonomous vehicles. Do you envisage that we should transition sort of continuously, in which we use the same infrastructure for both autonomous and human vehicles, and gradually have an increased percentage of autonomous, or should we create dedicated new infrastructure for the automated vehicles only?
We have more than enough infrastructure to handle travel. As some of those who have access to the chat box will see that we drive twice as much as our peers. And yeah, we really have enough, and we cannot build special lanes for 1% of the fleet. This has caused us lots of problems with high occupancy vehicle lanes and sort of suboptimal use of that infrastructure. So they have to be able to go from door to door, or, in certain settings, they have to be able to drive by themselves without any babysitting or special guardrails by these cities and these counties and these states. We will not be able to provide that at all to make for any kind of semi-continuous trip.
Okay, thank you.
Laura.
Thank you for your great talks. This is probably mostly for Ben. I was very impressed with the AA aspirations and what I learned with the transportation observatories, et cetera. But something that was timely, which none of you mentioned, that was in The Economist this week, about the deaths in the United States in traffic due to the weight of the vehicles. And they had compelling statistics. And I was wondering if any of you are folding that into your equation for traffic safety and some of the ideas that The Economist put forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. From a DOT perspective, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, is the regulator of vehicles. And so they are looking at those types of issues. But I wouldn't want to speak for them from a regulatory perspective. But certainly, I do know that article, was widely circulated in the transportation space.
Kara, would you like to say anything about vehicle weight?
Sure. Yeah, we drive monsters compared to most nations. So yeah, that they do a great deal of harm. They're very aggressive. They're, of course, very inefficient. But did she use the word dust from the weight from the tire and brake wear?
No, I didn't use that.
Sorry.
This was more just the weight of the vehicle and the deaths due to a certain weight vehicle, a medium weight, and a low weight vehicle, which was a factor of 20 different.
Yeah, well, we've studied that in depth as the Americans started buying SUVs to avoid the fuel economy standards that we had on what were light, passenger cars. So there was this sort of odd difference between work vehicles, pickups, and all the SUV manufacturers and minivan manufacturers managed to get into the truck classification, which caused great issues for this nation on fuel use and, of course, emissions. So yeah, we're very, very big. We absolutely need to go on a diet in lots of ways. So it is unfortunate. But I thought you were going to talk about the dust or particulates from the tire wear and that kind of thing, which is not nearly as dangerous for our lungs and other species as the other pollution coming off of these vehicles, because it is pretty large diameter.
Great. Paula, and then we'll go to our online.
Oh, yes. Well, Kara, I had a question about some of the concepts that you were describing in integrating AVs and some speed limitations. I'm wondering if there are incentivizing programs that would need to be in place either for consumers or from the government to enable these kinds of things to be implemented. What kinds of things will motivate consumers?
Yeah, I think, electric bikes is something a lot of people would love to have. Of course, we need to have speed limits on those too. They can be extremely dangerous. I've hurt myself just on a mountain bike with no cars around. And so, yeah, we definitely, I think, should be considering that. Like here in Austin, they've decided to add 2 light rail lines, which will serve about 1% of the population, really. And they're going to be charging every household about $300 a year for that. But with that kind of funding, you could hand out bikes over time. You could tag them, you could check on their management and maintenance. And so there's just a lot of really cost-effective things you can do, except for, of course, the people who cannot bike and who cannot drive or have too many bags and have little ones and things like that. So there, a mix of modes is really important in many settings. But I do think that would be an obvious incentive, as well as allowing transit agencies to start relying more on the all-electric vehicles that are in some of these TNC or ride-hailing fleets.
I'm going to take questions from a couple of the online participants. Bill Daly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a bunch of really great presentations. One thing that struck me was in Ben's presentation, the graph showing the number of traffic fatalities on U.S. roads going up in the last decade. And I was wondering if there was any research that pointed to the root cause of that and what things could be done to bring it back down. It seems like we're going the wrong direction. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would defer to Professor Kaufman as well, but I think that certainly there's research that's at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration about this issue and federal highways about this issue. Everything from driving at night to vehicle size or form factor to distraction. We at DOT just a couple weeks ago, we held a distraction sort of forum where researchers asserted that about a third of crashes occurred when somebody was using a cell phone during that time. And so that's a widely held perspective. And I think you're starting to see that, or at least some of this external research was showing how that might be borne out in telematics and so forth. But Professor Hoffman, I don't know if you have additional perspectives on that.
Yeah, Eric Horwitz asked me in the chat box because I mentioned that we have 4 times as many deaths per capita on our public roadways as our peer nations do, because we drive twice as much and we're twice as bad at it. And he was wondering why. So a lot of it is higher speeds, because we do have lots of lanes. We have wider lanes. We have wider clear zones outside those lanes. So drivers feel very confident. We also have extremely protective vehicle bodies around our bodies. So we don't care if we flip out. My son rolled 3 times with his friend who was trying to go 100 in a 55 and tagged another vehicle. I mean, incredibly dangerous stuff, and walked away from that. They should have died or been extremely injured. And so we really do crazy things with our vehicles because they're much bigger, they're much more protective. especially if you're strapped in. And this has caused us to lose a lot of the vulnerable users. And those are the people who are afraid to walk and bike. You know, they won't let their kids walk to school, which would be such a natural act in every other nation. But I do think there is less respect for life. There's lower civility, less respect for laws. I was recently in 5 different nations in Europe, much more, I think, honest behavior on transit use and things like that, and jaywalking and these kinds of things too. So it translates to the driving decisions. They have much more automated speed enforcement and some of the things I mentioned. We have much lower licensing standards. We let 16-year-olds drive with very little supervision. We don't have manual transmission. So, you're seeing a lot of the handling of the phone. We do fortunately have insurance companies trying to get us to keep their apps that come out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually CMT. So I talk to these people to know when the phone is being handled, and that will reduce your savings from using that app. And really, that should be on every kid's phone. There should probably be some kind of requirement that, with the graduated licensing that we have in this country now. But there's also extremely lax enforcement of traffic laws. We don't want our officers, we don't have many officers, but they're very expensive. So it just makes sense to use cameras roadside for this. So there's lots of reasons. It's, there's no other way to get around. So everybody has to drive, even if they don't feel very comfortable. They're not a very good driver. There's all sorts of reasons that we take twice as many lives per vehicle mile driven here.
And sorry, just to jump in on one other thing important to note is that pedestrian and cyclist fatalities have been increasing pretty dramatically over the past decade. And so the curve came down very effectively and then came back up. And now we're at levels that we haven't seen since sometime in the 1970s or early 80s, I think. So that's one example where you see a significant increase. But then if you peeled back if you looked at the data of the 42,000 and more fatalities we had in 2022, I think what you'd see is that there are things like drunk driving, drivers not using seatbelts, significant motorcycle fatalities. So there's a number of aspects that have been consistent safety challenges over the course of the data's history.
I want to bring Steve Armato back into this because a lot of the behaviors that you're talking about are very hard to regulate, but if you're by the federal government, for example, but if you're a company, you can impose safety. And so, Steve, would you like to comment on what Amazon's been able to do with respect to behaviors?
Thank you. Yeah, a couple comments here. One is, I think, relying on the population's best intentions, is not going to be the solution alone. I think this is where technology can really help. Whether it's technology built into consumer and commercial vehicles, like automated braking, can make a big difference. In-cab cameras and telematics, as was mentioned briefly before, can really help with things like distracted driving, detection of not following safety, like, for example, running a stop sign or turning right on red when that's not okay. So technology is really a good solution here. And as AI and machine learning combined with computer vision advance, I expect that that's going to be a game changer in terms of driving safety at scale. And then again, also the measurements. So whether it's leveraging traffic cameras or these telematics, the measurements are how we're going to collectively make a big difference in terms of changing behaviors and changing roadways.
Thank you. Eric Horvitz.
Thank you. I want to tie a couple of comments together and build on what Terry's question on infrastructure. I have a new car, and I was delighted to see that at on certain roadways, the automated driving says, let go of the steering wheel. We've understood this road well enough. We're confident, don't do anything, which is pretty impressive. Of course, that's interrupted quite frequently by saying, we don't understand this part of this infrastructure very well, grab the wheel again. Now, with that, I want to go beyond, Kara, you said we don't want to build new infrastructure. And back to Ben about the investments we're making, there can be quite a bit of I would think relatively low cost work to collaborate with the car manufacturers on lightweight sensing to add to roadways that would make them much more complete in hands-off. We're almost there with a few reflectors and what would be needed. I saw very little investment in that kind of infrastructure, Ben, in your bar graphs. And Kara, you said, "Oh my God, with AV, more driving gridlock, make it a little bit smarter. These cars can communicate with each other. Maybe you won't have gridlock if they understand lights and turns and you get rid of some of the standing waves in traffic based on lightweight automation combined with lightweight extensions of the infrastructure." Comments?
I'm happy to jump in. The first thing on when your vehicle is comfortable and when it isn't in that setting, my expectation would be that it has to do with when there's an HD map available of the roadway versus when there's not. It may also have to do with what the vehicle is seeing in terms of infrastructure. I'm not 100% sure of that, but the OEMs are mapping or procuring HD maps of roadways and using those to inform the ADAS, the ADAS systems that you're describing. So I think that is, you have a combination of HD mapping, increase, say, retro reflectivity or sensors that can speak to the vehicles. We've been making investments in connected vehicle technology that would allow infrastructure like traffic signals to connect in with vehicles. So I think what you're saying is correct, and probably the reality is that you're going to end up seeing kind of the belt and suspenders approach of a combination of mapping, sensing, and maybe obviously reliance on humans in the vehicles.
Is there collaboration going on with car manufacturers on the collaborative experience for how to do that well with current AI status of current AI?
I think it would probably be a good question for some of the folks you'll be talking to in Detroit. But I would say that certainly within the Department of Transportation, we are thinking about the intersection of mapping and how that connects into the ability of these systems to operate successfully.
Well, back to Steve Armato, is Amazon working with infrastructure, and what do you see as the future of autonomous delivery?
Well, yeah, we're working closely with the FMCSA. I met them last year, and we have things like conspicuity tape that we're adding to the sides of our trailers. This basically helps with visibility, which then in turn helps to reduce cases where a community member might strike one of our trailers or vans. We also have things like, you may have seen this already on some consumer vehicles, but essentially strobing brake lights. So if you slam on the brake or even tap the brakes, the brake lights will kind of blink and then go steady. We found that these are statistically, very promising in terms of reducing injuries and reducing crashes, particularly in the case that we're struck. And so these are a good and very practical examples of applying technology, to create safety. My point of view is like, if one were to go with autonomous, it has to be perfect all the time. And so, practically, I'm sure that there are things that we can do to help make the roadways safer. But there's always going to be some anomaly and some road. And so I think these things can probably help, but it's got to be perfect 100.0% of the time. And I think that's going to be really tough with trying to, make every single road compliant to a new technology. So my point of view, kind of on a personal level, is that we're going to have to make sure our systems, whichever systems for autonomous are able to handle any scenario.
Great. We're going to move to Steve Pacala.
So this is primarily for Ben, but any of you could answer. I'm curious about the development of information about intersections, for example, the way you talked about, Ben, as a public good. Right now, private companies have an incentive to keep the information they collect private. So Waymo wants to license its technology to the big three. And it keeps it out of the hands of the public, and it keeps the public from being as safe as they would be if it were delivered more quickly and ubiquitously. The same thing is true of federal incentives. So I can imagine that R&D would progress faster if you got sensors above a critical mass in individual cities first, so that you could realize the benefits of machine learning and other technologies to control intersections and that sort of thing, rather than providing a federal incentive across the board that would cause light uptake everywhere and take decades to come to fruition the way we're going now. Have you run cost-benefit analyses on the deployment model for federal incentives that would provide the most rapid and the largest benefits to the public?
Sure. So on the first question about the public good, I completely agree with you that that's a huge opportunity in the in what I could squeeze in from this AI aspirations talk, which there is a link if you're interested in the fuller details. We contemplated this idea of creating a geospatial database, which would kind of be like a low definition map of both roadways and users. And if that were a public good, what would it do to enable transportation planners and engineers to leverage those insights in order to make more data-informed decisions about where they could target roadway interventions, say like infrastructure interventions. And I think that that type of example would, we have not run the numbers on the cost benefit of that, but I would be very confident that based on the hundreds of billions of dollars that we spend on infrastructure, that the insights that systems like that would yield would be hugely beneficial and would also allow for more equitable deployment and more targeted deployment of safety interventions. On this question of critical mass of sensing, I also agree with you that that what we've seen has been sort of a series of pilot projects or small scale efforts around an intersection or maybe around a corridor that don't necessarily yield scalable applications and innovation ecosystems to come in to those markets. So we often will have a sensor provider who maybe is also the analytics provider who's going to provide some insight back to an agency, and that's sort of the totality of the engagement. What we contemplated, and I think actually in this AI aspirations concept, we didn't go all the way of saying we want a national HD map, which there are people who would advocate for that, and other countries that have sought to produce those. But I think that what you have there is the opportunity to induce an innovation ecosystem, which we actually don't really have in the transportation sector, where it would be far easier for companies to produce insights because they would have much lower cost or free access to information to sort of build software products or insights on top of, and where you'd also have an ability for state or local agencies who develop approaches to have those approaches easily scaled from one place to another because those systems are built on standardized national data. So I think it is a huge opportunity. My gut instinct is that having denser applications where you can prove out the concepts is a good one. I think that doesn't get you to this sort of national innovation ecosystem. It would allow you to demonstrate applications in a local place. So I think you probably need both in order to really to harness a broader set of companies and researchers who can provide value to cities and communities across the country.
I would just add a couple of things on here as well. One, I think it's important to remember, safety benefits everyone. There's no proprietary benefit to keeping, knowing which roads are unsafe and having just one company know that. So, I'll give you an example. We're partnering with the FMCSA and the maker of those strobing brake lights to make sure that the regulations are changed so that anyone using those brake lights is able to be, compliant, as opposed to seeking a company-specific exception. And similarly, if we see unsafe conditions, we would report that to the right authorities and make sure that that's improved. So I think it's important to keep in mind safety is not something that's, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and each of us contributing, knowing where things are unsafe and sharing that back to the authorities is going to be helpful for everybody.
Fantastic. We're going to take questions from Maria Zuber, then Bill Press. And no, I've got a long list, and then Dan Arvizo online.
Great. Thank you for all these fascinating comments. So Ben, I was initially taken by your comment about what the government invests in transportation research relative to other regulated industries. And then we heard from Steve about all kinds of investments that Amazon is making, some of which really seem to be in the public good and not just benefiting Amazon. And since we have the two of you plus Cara, who brings the academic perspective, I'd really love to hear from the three of you your perspectives on what should the government be funding and what is industry's role here. And I think you addressed some of this a little bit, but also include in this, beyond the benefits from the research itself, the role in training young people who would go into these fields of transportation safety. So maybe start with Steve.
Yeah, I can start with a couple. If considering where subsidies would be given, I would consider what would be good things for commercial or consumer vehicles, passenger vehicles, to invest in safety technology. So, for example, maybe there's a discount on lane keeping aid when I buy a vehicle. There's a large subsidy for electric vehicles today, but in addition to that, emergency braking, lane keeping, blind spot detection, those are proven to be improving safety. And so I would consider investments in those areas. And the other one would be making sure that we've got the right data and analytics on which roadways and corridors are less safe, and making sure that infrastructure investments are made there as proactively as possible to get ahead of it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that the private sector is investing a lot in vehicles, in routing and navigation. I think you're seeing, and I'm sure that Amazon is connected into all of those aspects, as are other manufacturers and companies that you'll be speaking to during your time this week. The areas that and these are not exclusive, but the areas that I've been focusing on, infrastructure and usage, there has, for whatever market-driven reasons, even though we're actually collecting a lot of information, for example, about routing, and those are about mapping that it informs, just routing tools that I'm sure we all use, like Google and Apple Maps, that information actually is not easily available to improve safety, other than you maybe your choice of your own trip, knowing where you're going. So that information doesn't necessarily flow into transportation agencies. And I think what's important to remember is that state and local agencies own every roadway practically, and in partnership with federal funding agreements and arrangements. And so those are the stewards of the system. And so there can be lots and lots of R&D in the vehicle side, in all the additional technology elements. But ultimately, I think what is really the low-hanging fruit is to provide technology that can support state and local agencies in making the best choices about infrastructure improvements and safety improvements. And there are a lot of federal resources that are going toward that aim. And my hope would be that those agencies have the best information. And what we see as the market gaps, where I think that the information is not sort of systemically available, is number one, is information about their infrastructure such that they can really make equitable and data-driven decisions about where they could build a pedestrian network that would allow people to safely access school or access work by walking, or intersection improvements. Where can they daylight crosswalks, meaning removing the parking space right before a stop sign or a crosswalk, so that a turning vehicle can see where pedestrians are waiting to cross, or doing curb extensions to shorten the distance to cross. These are actions that agencies take. And I think we'd be really well served if they had the information that told them where these places are. And it sounds like they should know this. I think that many maybe anecdotally know it, but we don't have the sort of like enterprise systems where this type of information is easily managed. And the further up you get in the food chain, as you get to the state DOTs, that is where there really could be an overabundance of information about where are the targeted interventions we can make. And that's how the money flows down, for the most part, to the local governments. And so I think that that providing more information about that is key. And then also usage. we've talked a lot about vehicles. We have pretty good measurements, and I think better measurements in the private sector than we do in government, but measurements of traffic and vehicle usage. So there are companies that will have partnerships with the OEMs that are collecting information about, and we know with fair certainty about where there's travel or where there's traffic, where there's congestion. The mapping companies know that as well. But we don't have very much information at all about where people walk, where people bike, how people walk to school, where they walk to the bus stop. That information doesn't have systemic data collection. And I think that you'd have to bring in federal R&D. The methods are there, but you'd have to have a real effort in order to say, we actually really want to measure this information on to the granularity where it can inform local decisions in terms of, here is exactly where we need to make these safety interventions, because it will help someone, help people who live in a neighborhood get to work on this bus line or something like that.
Thank you. Bill Press.
Yeah, I wonder what is the future of rail? And I'm thinking not just of what you can put on the tracks, or not just the tracks, but the right-of-ways, which of course would be almost impossible to replicate today from scratch. Kara, I'm also from Austin, and Kara mentioned the inefficiency of the light rail as an investment, using the right-of-way, at least in part, that was there previously. Are there better things to do with underutilized rail right-of-ways, or better things to do with the rails that are on them?
So I sit next to one of our nation's top rail experts, Tyler Dick, and so I learned through osmosis here, but my understanding is we have the widest gauge in the world, along with Canada and Australia. So it's hard to electrify, I'm afraid. Our trains, they're so big, they carry so much tonnage. So trains are mostly used for passengers in other countries, and Amtrak takes a back seat to these private owners of these rights of way. So double tracking is really important if you want to reduce some of and increase some of the capacity, because you have to be able to have passing at different speeds on these corridors. Electrification would be great too. Hard to do with the 200 vehicles or train cars that they're pooling on average now in this country. So real major movement of freight. It's about 15%, I think, of ton miles moved in this country is still on rail. Personally, I would love to see more double tracking and a little bit better safety provision. So these are privately managed businesses. We saw some terrible things in Ohio. And I'm not sure what Ben and Steve would recommend. Steve, does Amazon use the rail system much?
We do. And even though it's not a new technology, it's very helpful, particularly for long movements. For example, once we import inventory, dispersing it across the country. So for example, if we import into the West Coast, then getting that inventory to the East Coast is actually very good in terms of cost and sustainability versus alternatives. And it turns out to be, when you are making these longer movements, it turns out to actually be, sometimes faster or speed neutral. So, we're a big fan of this, particularly for dispersing goods predictively.
Yeah, one thing I'd add, and I'm not an expert on rail issues, but we could point you to some experts within our department. But we've actually been investing a lot in UAS and drones, and I'm sure that Steve perhaps Steve could speak to this topic as well. But I've heard of the idea of using rail right of way for drone deliveries, and we're starting to see some real life examples of drone deliveries for medical devices or medicines or things that are sort of you need quickly and are high value products to get to communities. But I think that is an area where you're going to start seeing a lot of both innovation and activity in the coming decades.
But wouldn't that be long distance and impractical for drone delivery? I'm not sure I quite understand that.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of about where is their dedicated right of way, and it's sort of linked into the regulatory issues of where drones can fly beyond visual line of sight. So I'm not suggesting that doing long drone trips is what would make sense, but I think that I've heard of industry thinking about that issue.
Okay, Dan Arvizu, then Arti Prabhakar.
Great. Thank you, Francis. Well, thank you all for a tremendous set of both presentations and now follow-up discussions. This is extremely interesting to me personally. A topic we haven't talked about yet in this conversation, and I'd love to get the perspective of all of you. Steve, it's primarily to you, but it really has to do with, I sit on the board of a major insurance company. And we think about these issues at the board level and talk about how you invest in the high technology, those kinds of things. And it's very clear that a partnership between the OEMs, the manufacturers, and the insurance companies could benefit both of those parties, certainly in terms of pricing risk, which is the insurance companies want to do, right? That's what they want to do. And the automakers that want to have safe, and compelling product to sell, right? What's missing in my perspective, and again, this is where the opportunity to really engage is how does that affect public policy? As you know, insurance companies are regulated state by state, so you got all of these other dynamics in play as to what you can and can't do. Whether you do your, all the insurance companies have some sort of a telematics sensor that you can put into the vehicles, and that would complement whatever the OEMs might put in as basic safety information or other kinds of sensors and technologies. But this very complex mosaic of how these partnerships might or might not work, I'd love to get your perspectives on what's in the public interest. How can either the federal government augment or also facilitate this advancement of the application of technology, but in a way that doesn't just benefit one sector versus the second sector versus the public service that we all care about immensely. So I'd just love to get your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Well, I guess I would start, the key is data. And, the insurance companies probably have one of the best sets of data around what are unsafe behaviors and unsafe areas, and creating incentives to then address those unsafe areas. I think as we've seen in passenger cars, the telematics that, for example, I think I've seen Mercedes has something that detects drowsiness. These things that are in real-time feedback loops that are inside the vehicle and can detect driver behavior and immediately correct it, that forms a very tight feedback loop so that you're not finding out days or weeks later that there was an issue, but you're finding out in real time, ideally before there's an issue. So I would continue to focus on those areas. On a personal point of view, privacy is top of mind for everyone in the US and Europe, et cetera. And so I imagine some of the passenger points where like insurance companies want an app on their phone. Me as a consumer, I don't use those because I value the privacy. But if my car has those things built in where it's a feedback loop straight back to me, that's one that I'm comfortable using and I like to use.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think a couple things are true. One is that U.S. car insurance, personal auto insurance, is expensive. My understanding is that it's more expensive than most other countries. And I think that, to Steve's point, there is this complex set of trade-offs about inducing more safe behavior versus privacy versus maybe adverse selection or unfairness that could exist in the underwriting process because of where we've built unsafe roadways. It's one of the fears I have about, as we think about delivering much more granular safety information, what are the unintended consequences for, say, the insurance industry, where we revealed that decisions 50 years ago might be to build infrastructure in certain neighborhoods might affect people's ability to get a fair price on car insurance. So I think that it is a rich and complex area. The truth is that we spend more on personal auto insurance than we spend on highway infrastructure or roadway infrastructure. It represents, my estimation was it represents 1% of US GDP. And because the fact that we underperform peer countries in safety, I think it's a huge opportunity to put more money in the pockets of Americans if we can figure out how to create safer driving behavior.
Thank you. Arthi, did you have a question?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all. A great discussion. Really appreciate your being here. My question is about vehicle autonomy. And Kara, at the start of this session in your presentation, I wondered about, these are two linked questions. You mentioned an 85% reduction in crash costs from AVs. I'm curious about where that comes from. And I'm also curious about the contrast between where we are with vehicle autonomy. And Steve, your very precise 100.0% that we have to achieve before it would make sense from where you sit. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll drop in the chat box the URL for that paper, but we went technology by technology within the vehicle and crash by crash type across the nation and the frequency of those things and the likelihood that we could best guess on how that would address that type of crash. And so, and then
Kara, I'm sorry. I actually didn't understand what you meant by 85%. Does that mean when there's a crash, the costs are less? Or are you saying 85% fewer crashes?
Yeah, so it's a combination of those. So the crash costs in this country are now about $1 trillion a year, and I guess the size of our GDP is about 26 trillion a year. So to give you a sense of scale, so it's about $3,000 per person per year of crash losses, and about 2/3 of that is through non-economic things, like a spouse who maybe doesn't have a job right now is having to help out in lots of ways, and there's delays to people on the road that would be counted typically in the econ side of it, but obviously the medical damages, the vehicle repair, that's all economic costs, but there's a lot of other costs that come with the hassle of owning and operating and maintaining a vehicle, especially during times of crash. So it's about $1 trillion a year, and about 85% of that, which is very similar to the number of crashes. But what happens a lot is it moderates. It starts your braking much faster, much earlier. Before you notice it, the car notices it. And so it helps deliver a less severe crash in many cases. So a lot of the fatalities become severe crashes. A lot of severe crashes become non-severe crashes, maybe minor injury or property damage only type crashes, or they completely avoid the crash. So yeah, it's a combination of how we get to that. I'll drop that URL into the chat box in case anybody wants to take a look.
And I'll just go back to the point I made about 100.0 is that if we're going to rely on augmentation of roadways, for example, installing sensors on roads, an autonomous vehicle would need to have, any road that it's on would need to have that augmentation. And so the point is that you've got to have full coverage in order to, if you're going to rely on that infrastructure. So, I think it's important for autonomous systems to actually be able to autonomously make decisions as opposed to relying on sort of installed infrastructure. But more generally, I think the cool thing about autonomy is that there are multiple levels. And again, I've mentioned emergency braking, lane keeping, blind spot detection. Those are sort of the first level. There's also, you've probably seen again in consumer cars, adaptive cruise control. On our trucks, we have maximum speed limiters as well. These are all things that sort of help to graduate towards autonomous driving. But in the near term, they make the roadways safer and help assist drivers even when there is not autonomy in the sense of having no driver. So we're really excited about how this sort of the precursors of autonomy can help to improve safety.
Actually, Steve, do you see autonomy going forward outside the United States? I mean, is Amazon doing any of that outside the US?
It's not so the regulations are not my area of expertise in terms of fully international, but I think anywhere that is amenable to it is great, and Amazon would be interested in trying it.
Oh, great. So we'll move to Kathy Watecki, then Dennis Asanas.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to offer my thanks also to the speakers and all of the discussion that we've been having. This is really terrific. I live in a very rural area, and my whole background has been in agricultural R&D. So my question, I guess, is mainly addressed to Kara, but I'd like to hear everybody's viewpoints about the transportation issues from the rural perspective. We are highly agricultural, big part of our economy. And we're highly reliant on fossil fuels for all of the farm equipment, as well as the semis that bring the products to processors. And our transportation safety issues are less the kind of ones that we've been talking about and more avoiding hitting deer, causing a lot of traffic accidents on our rural roads. So where does rural fit into this whole picture?
So about 15% of the US population lives in what is defined as rural, but maybe 20% or even 25% of our driving might be out there. And of course, a lot of it is off-road use of energy on those parcels. So these are not highway grade vehicles that she is referring to, I think, that may have difficulty being electrified. And if they were, could they even fast charge given the grid conditions that you have for power out there? And I'm not sure that they could. But I do think that, you know, we've had an electric lawnmower for our lawns for 25 years here in Austin, and we're still using the darn thing. It's corded, so it's not as easy as my electric blower, but there's a lot of applications for smaller things. But when there's really heavy torque involved, you know, it can be a very expensive battery and asset to add there. So I'm not sure, but on the topic of animal vehicle collisions, I do have papers I'll drop into that chat box. So TxDOT had me do this for them. And, you know, in addition to deer in many parts of the Austin and San Antonio region, we also have dogs near the border with Mexico that are not being spayed and neutered. So there's a lot of dogs running wild and babies of dogs. And so there's a lot of collisions with these kinds of animals. And so I've been hoping that we can add some reporting. Just if you see a deer approaching your location because you live there and you love the deer, or because you just drove by, you can alert Waze app, which is owned by Google, and they might get it into their navigation app. So as you're driving, to help that. But I can tell you, Kathy, you know, basically it is that rutting season. It's that October, November, December period at about twilight and dusk that we're seeing most of those AVs, those animal vehicle collisions. So that I'm always on alert when I'm driving in my neighborhood too, even here in suburban Austin, because of that real safety issue. And I do think that's an easy one. I also think that the cameras on our cars could be saying, oh, I just saw an endangered ocelot here in Texas. I just saw a deer, and reporting that wirelessly to the cloud, which then, if you are using a navigation app, might be reported to you if Google wants to do us another favor. This is an incredible resource that we have here for travel time and hazards and other things like that. And tolling now, finally, they have that on the app. So I'd love to see that added. And I can also just, you know, if I want to protect the deer in my neighborhood, or I'm the local DOT, I can just post cameras in those common locations and infer what's happening and flash if people don't want to use a navigation app, but I can also push it to those who are willing to listen to what's ahead. And that can really help when those animals are moving through.
Thank you.
I'll add a couple things on rural. You know, so first of all, I think this is an area where drones are going to be great, because we basically bring to sort of a central area, and then drones can easily land in a field, etc. And then sort of more directly in terms of the fact that the roads and mapping may not be as high quality. Over the last 2 years, we've been developing something called Fleet Edge, which actually automatically detects changes in roads, traffic signs, highways, and it's continuously refreshing on-road information and back in our mapping software. And so that then helps us to provide the most up-to-date routing information to drivers, such as, hey, there's a stop sign coming up. And so that, you know, that sort of ever evolving and sort of every continuous mapping is really exciting for us.
And
Is that
just
from satellite? How do you get that
it's
information?
from outward facing cameras to the side and to the front that's detecting changes in roads.
Interesting. So your vans are reporting back on all of these? Or
Well, they're detecting these specific things like a new stop sign or a new intersection, and then basically detecting that object change, which then is reported back.
great. Dennis, you're next.
Can I just add one quick thing on that? Because I wanted to emphasize that rural crashes, so crashes on rural roadways account for more than 40% of traffic fatalities. And so there actually is a very disproportionate safety impact on rural roadways. And there's a lot of reasons why, and infrastructure is one of them. And so having a better understanding of where there are guardrails, where's their reflectivity and other things that will make driving safer, where there are roadway kind of geometric designs that are maybe either unsafe or out of contact, where speeds are too high relative to the geometric nature of the roadways. Another key aspect is post-crash care. And so in a lot of cases, there are people who are still alive after a crash, but because it's harder to get to those victims of crashes, they have a higher rate of becoming fatalities. And so what we are seeing there, and our National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is working on this issue. How do you work with first responders? How do you both have better digital systems in order to pinpoint where crashes are? As vehicles become smarter, there's more of an opportunity to instantly know where there's a crash, where that vehicle is located, where there might have been a roadway runoff that we didn't know about. And then also, how do you use things like we've been hearing about drones for blood transfusions, for example, getting them into the field or assessing post-crash damage. So really important issue. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you. Dennis.
Sorry.
You have to keep pushing it.
Okay. So thank you all for fascinating presentations and discussions. I've got the following question. Autonomous vehicles are obviously consumers of electric power. They're very hungry with all the sensory activity. The challenge is that the electricity is not as clean always, right, in terms of how it is produced to start with. And then the adoption of all electric vehicles that have become almost synonymous with autonomous varies a lot around the world. I mean, we can only see this country, but also other places in the world. So I'm wondering if in your thinking, to avoid this chicken and egg story, we can think of other sources of energy and powertrains like fuel cells and even internal combustion engines running on hydrogen or ammonia that could perhaps power those autonomous vehicles to see some faster penetration.
Who would like to take that? Kara, I know you'd like to, and maybe Steve, you can comment on what Amazon sees as the future of fuels. And Kara, why don't you start?
Sure. So, I mean, I do think nuclear is pretty important, and we've had a devil of a time permitting that and getting that rolled out. But I do think that is important with a lot of sporadic, or unreliable feedstocks that we'd like to have in the mix. We also need higher capacity lines and things like that. So before we go into hydrogen, but yeah, all my friends who are experts and have been watching hydrogen for decades do feel it's still way too expensive. You need to do it in a place like wave action where you've got just wasted energy and you've got a place to hold it and deliver it to a very special type of vehicle to burn it. So I don't expect that anytime soon. I certainly would not pin my hopes on it. I think solar is a much, much better bet at scale. I do think airlines don't have a lot of options, heavy battery packs for the longer distance flights. And so I think they are looking right now at biofuels and on-ground operations on the tarmac. They could do hydrogen and that kind of thing, but not for the flights yet. But I do have a colleague who thinks that we could beam energy to a hybrid version of a plane for long distance trips that's coming from solar farms in rural areas and send that up in the sky which is interesting. He's a physicist, an electrical engineer, but those are the only things I've heard of that I think might make sense for.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to?
So, of course, we have electric delivery vans that we're rolling out. I think we're also in our trucking area, we have a large fleet of renewable natural gas. So we're definitely interested in all sorts of fuel. And we look at the supply chain of the fuel as well. For some of our flights, we're using sustainable aviation fuel. But for example, on the renewable natural gas, we've partnered with dairy farms to essentially cap their areas, which then harvests that renewable natural gas, and then partnering with companies who then can basically do the supply chain of that fuel and then get it to where we're doing our refueling of our trucks. So, that's an example of, electric for Class 8 trucking is not yet sort of ready for prime time. And so in the interim, we've invested in that area of renewable natural gas, and we're excited about it. And again, with our last mile, we're doing electric already. We've also recently announced that Amazon is offsetting 100% of its energy usage. So that's earlier than we had pledged.
What a fabulous session. I'm going to wrap this up now and thank all three speakers. This has been very stimulating, very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Back to the PCAST meeting. A welcome to our members and members of the general public, and a special shout out because we have some in-person members of the public here with us today. So we welcome colleagues from the University of Michigan, Michigan Central, and Wayne State who are here with us today. So happy to have you with us. It's time to talk about infrastructure. Could you guys turn off your videos? Okay. Okay, thank you. Bill? All right, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Maria Zuber. I'm a co-chair of PCAST, and I will be moderating this session on infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure serves as the backbone for economic activity, social mobility, and local and regional connectivity. Optimizing infrastructure requires consideration of sustainability, resilience, accessibility, and equity. And it often infuses, and it should infuse, judicious use of new technology. So we're excited to have a window into infrastructure planning and implementation world with today's speakers. I'll introduce the speakers now and note that longer biographical information is available online on the PCAST website and in the members' agenda books. So speaking to us today will be Rachel Neeler, who is Deputy Director of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, Zachary Cole-Loden, Chief Infrastructure Officer and Director of the Michigan Infrastructure Office, and Nathaniel Ford, who is CEO of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. So I will invite Rachel to get us started with some brief remarks. Rachel, while you're speaking, you can turn on your video. All of the speakers, while you're speaking, turn on your videos. Otherwise, to the PCAST members and others, please keep your videos off until we start the discussion. So, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Rachel, I don't know if we can hear you.
Ooh, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really, really excited to be here today. Thank you for having me. Zach, really wish I could be up there on stage with you. I saw you, the sole presenter up there, but thank you so much for having me virtually. So I am Rachel Neeler, the Deputy Director for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, and I'm here to share how our office, the Joint Office, is supporting the transition to a fully decarbonized transportation sector, specifically with electrification as a solution. Next slide, please. Undoubtedly, you've heard from the earlier speakers about the urgency of the climate crisis and the importance of reducing our emissions. And transportation is currently the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and we're in the middle of a major transformation to decarbonize. In September of 2022, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, and Housing and Urban Development published the Decarbonization Blueprint, a whole of government approach to addressing every segment of the transportation sector to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. You can see in the report the various technology and design solutions that are needed to realize this proposed future. And one with great promise on the far left here is electrification. It also has a lot of near-term technology readiness. Along with electrifying vehicles comes a once-in-a-lifetime investment goal and vision from the Biden-Harris administration on EV infrastructure through the Early on in the administration, this was a clear priority with a goal to get to 500,000 chargers by 2030, and has since been supported by Congress with $7.5 billion in public investments that support not only the backbone of the fast charger network to support long distance travel, but also community charging. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We have our first stations operational in Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Maine, Vermont, Utah, and Rhode Island, with hundreds of charging ports coming each through the end of this year, thousands in various level of deployment, and ultimately hundreds of thousands to support everyone who wants to ride and drive electric. But what might you notice about these early stations? They kind of look like gas stations. So based on our ability to work with the Federal Highway Administration and state DOTs on quickly deploying stations and meeting the needs of EV drivers, we are seeing the first chargers focused on high-speed charging to support long-distance travel. However, community charging awards of more than $1.1 billion has also been made available, and we look forward to seeing the next wave of urban and rural charging deployments, because we know from an NREL study, National Renewable Energy Lab study in June of 2023, next slide, that to support 50% EV sales, we need, or about 33 million EVs on the road by 2030. We need, next slide, approximately 1.2 million public charging ports, and about 1 million of those are actually lower speed level 2 charging in communities, at workplaces, to support multi-unit housing, and at retail locations, with a large foundation of expected home charging as well, which you can see in orange. However, to fully realize a future where everyone can ride and drive electric, we must have public and private investments. We're seeing that now with commitments to support EV charging from automakers and site hosts like Pilot, BP Pulse, Love's, Sheetz, hotels like Marriott and Hilton, and urban-centric charging like Revel, ChargePoint, and Whole Foods. Next slide. And there are currently 192,000 public charging ports available today. So we're on our way, but we're not quite there yet. Next slide. Overall, what does success look like? We want all EV drivers to have a great customer experience. We want this national network to be affordable for all drivers. We need the national network to work every time and support managed charging. And we want to ensure everyone, anyone, anywhere, any income can ride and drive electric. Underlying all of these is a constant need for improvements and innovation, because we are building a national charging network, not just for 2024, but for the future. Next slide. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And now we'll move on to Zach.
All right, thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here in person with all of you. It was only a 10-minute drive for me, so I thought it was probably worth making the trip. I am the Chief Infrastructure Officer for the governor, which means I'm sort of her advisor on how to help achieve her infrastructure agenda using federal funds as one of our main tools. And I'm also the director of the Michigan Infrastructure Office, which coordinates efforts to obtain federal funding between state agencies, provides resources and surge capacity for agencies and local units of government to win federal grants, and manages the state's competitiveness fund, which allows us to come up with our share of the non-federal match required and be as nimble as possible in pursuing federal grants and federal funding. So I was asked to cover the challenges of water infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and clean energy infrastructure in the next 6.5 minutes. So let's get into it. The bipartisan infrastructure law was not ever intended or designed to completely close the infrastructure maintenance gap, which in this country is quite substantial. Even before the supply chain challenges, which caused costs to rise and projects to slow down, we thought that the infrastructure law could address about 10% of the deferred maintenance gap. And Michigan is a great example of that deferred maintenance gap in action. We experienced massive population growth in Michigan between 1930 and 1960. And as those tax bases grew, infrastructure grew up around those growing communities. That infrastructure is now, as you can, if you can kind of do the math, 65 to 100 years old at this point, which means two things. One, that it's been through a lot, and needs a significant amount of attention. In fact, recently I was underneath the Detroit River looking at the drainage system for the tunnel to Canada, which is constantly taking on water that we pump out back into the river. So some fun design choices back in the 1930s and 40s, some of the design choices are just different than those that we would make today. So I'll give you an example in the water infrastructure context. Back in the first half of the 20th century, many communities built what are called combined systems for both wastewater and stormwater. And they would then push all the water that flowed into the system, essentially untreated, into our rivers and lakes and streams. That obviously caused some health hazards that folks got hip to, in the middle of the 20th century and started sort of the wastewater treatment revolution. Today, those systems still exist, and when it rains, the wastewater is sort of pushed off to a treatment plant and then pushed back into the system. When it rains, those systems can become overwhelmed. Now, 20 years ago, that wasn't such a huge problem because we were not experiencing as many 100-year storms as we're experiencing now. But as I'm sure you've heard, 100-year storms have picked up in frequency. So that means these combined sewer events, which is a really polite way of saying that the dirty water from your toilet is flowing back up into our city streets, are happening more and more. Communities do not have the tax base to uncouple their systems alone, especially not in states like Michigan, which in most cases are holding steady with population, not increasing in population anymore. So when we think about the long-term infrastructure challenge and long-term funding challenges, we have to reckon with the fact that communities that are now experiencing slower growth don't really have the financial wherewithal to modernize their systems. Moving on quickly to transportation, broadly speaking, the way that we think about transportation needs is in terms of the pavement quality of our roads when it comes to highway transportation, and on-time performance in our rail and public transit systems. Now, Michigan, for reasons that I don't have time to get into in this meeting, really lags behind in the public transit and rail space, which is its own challenge and something that our leaders need to address structurally. But I want to talk about road condition for a moment. When we are able to stay on top of maintenance, when we're able to address the needs of our roads before they become critical, that saves us about $6 for every dollar that we spend. If anyone is looking at my slides, you can probably find this slide and put it up on the screen now. I don't know where it is in the pack, but I'll just keep going and you can put it up. So addressing needs as they arise is critical. That's even more challenging for bridges, which cost an incredible amount to maintain and, if necessary, rebuild. But the same ROI calculation applies. If we can stay ahead of the maintenance curve, we can save money down the road. This applies across a range of categories of infrastructure. For transportation and electrical infrastructure, the ROI on spending now versus spending in the future is usually around 4 or 5 to 1. And it peters off a little bit in other sectors, in telecom and non-residential construction. It's in the 2 to 3 to 1 range, but it's still quite positive. So when we make investments like we did in the bipartisan infrastructure law, that helps our country stay on a fiscally sustainable track and helps states like Michigan that have such serious deferred maintenance needs also stay on track. Finally, I'll move to clean energy infrastructure, which is sort of, I'm going to use it as a stand-in for the infrastructure of the future, although it's actually, that category is actually quite a bit thicker and covers other needs like data centers and semiconductor manufacturing and many other things. But we'll focus on clean energy for the moment. In order to support the kind of electric vehicle transportation system that Rachel just discussed, we need not only fueling stations, but transmission infrastructure that supports the distribution of electricity to those stations. We also need clean energy to ensure that our Rivians and our Ford Mustangs and even our Teslas are pulling clean energy from the grid and not pulling dirtier power sources like coal or natural gas in some cases from the grid. And so that requires dramatic build out of our clean energy infrastructure. For years, decades even, Michigan clean energy projects have struggled with siting challenges. Solar, wind, typically in state law do not enjoy the same kinds of preemptory protections that oil and gas do. Preemptory protections that were built into law in the middle of the 20th century or in some cases earlier. And so that really creates a disadvantage for siting and also an expectation of increased costs as clean energy developers look at the approval process and think, I'm going to have to spend $30 on legal fees for every $10 that I would have to spend if this were an oil or gas project. So we are helping to accelerate clean energy deployment by addressing barrier removal head on. We've created a process by which developers can bring their clean energy projects to the Michigan Public Service Commission for an inclusive, deliberative process that applies the same standard for every project across the state. And what that does is it makes it so that developers don't have to deal with the patchwork of ever-shifting laws at the local level that are often reactive to false narratives about the effect of clean energy on a local community. It allows those voices to still be heard at the state level process, but balanced against the state's broader need for power. The last thing I want to say about that is that really we believe every community should have access to clean energy resources, access to the jobs associated with building these projects, maintaining these projects, and our law and Eagle's programs have created a variety of ways to empower communities to host these projects. We have the Renewable Ready Communities program, which was funded by about $125 million grant from the Environmental Protection Agency. We have technical assistance available to communities to help them think through the effects of these projects locally. And we have a program that is designed to help communities and developers turn brownfield sites into usable assets that no longer create blight in the community and actually create reliable, affordable power for communities. Broadly speaking, like I said, every community should have access to these resources. That means urban communities with a lot of brownfields. It means communities with agricultural land, and we believe that solar can actually be an asset to the agricultural sector in many cases, as it provides an additional source of revenue for family farms. So we are doing everything we can to meet the goal set in our Clean Energy and Jobs Act through barrier removal, through those services. And we're also building the supply chain to supply the solar industry right here in Michigan, both to position Michigan as a leader in clean energy manufacturing and also to de-risk the supply chain for these critical projects, so that we're not as reliant on parts and manufacturing in hostile nations. So I'll leave it there. Probably a lot more to cover, but I think we have some Q&A coming up.
Great. Thank you very much, Zach. And now we will move on to Nathaniel.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I'd like to thank Laura and all the members of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for this wonderful opportunity to talk to you about mobility and infrastructure, but most importantly, how by harnessing advances in technology and innovation, we can improve the mobility of our nation. And I believe the JTA is doing exactly that. I'm Nat Ford. I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. And through this presentation, I'm going to try and show you how the JTA has had a great deal of success in delivering on transformative mobility solutions. And this, for me, it's a 4-decade career in terms of transportation, starting my career as a train conductor with the New York MTA, and then having the honor of serving as the CEO of the SFMTA in San Francisco and the MARTA system in Atlanta, and now the JTA in Jacksonville, Florida. Next slide, please. The JTA is an agency of the state of Florida, and it is governed by a 7-member board of directors, 3 of them appointed by the mayor of the city of Jacksonville, 3 by the governor of Florida, and the 7th being the district secretary for Florida's Department of Transportation. We're rather unique because our origins as an authority started out as an expressway authority with the capital acumen to build roads and bridges. And then later on in our development, we then assumed responsibility for public transportation in Duval County, and now it has grown to a number of our adjoining counties in Northeast Florida. Our portfolio of services are fixed route bus service that you're all familiar with. And in this past year, we had an 8.7% increase in ridership. So we're returning to the pre-COVID ridership levels. We have a connection, our connection service, which is our paratransit service. And we have a premium paratransit service, which is more Uber-like in design, door-to-door. And you can actually summon it with a PDA, a personal digital device. And we have a 15% increase in ridership as compared to last fiscal year. We also operate the St. Johns River Ferry, a car and passenger ferry link between Mayport Village and the Fort George Island area across the St. Johns River. And we are so excited that just yesterday we were notified that we received a $15.6 million federal award to purchase a second environmentally friendly vessel. And so we're very excited about that recent news. We have an automated people mover that operates on a monorail in downtown Jacksonville, and I'll discuss a bit more in my presentation as it relates to its future. And then we have a series of alternative mobility options, a number of on-demand services that we provide, giving greater flexibility and reliability to our customers, and at the same time, dealing with the first mile, last mile connectivity to our fixed route services. Those services are Ready Ride Zones, which began as 4 zones a number of years ago, and now it is totaling 13 zones where we are providing door-to-door service in our community. We have Door to Store, which is a free service for residents in food deserts, so they're able to get transportation to local markets with fresh produce, meats, and more. Then My Ride to School, something we're very proud of. It's a free service to middle and high school students, as well as college age students. This is helping our schools that are facing a shortage of bus operators and bus drivers for school bus systems. And it's helping us create the ridership of tomorrow. Just last week, we set a new record with carrying over 2,000 students in one day. We also operate a number of regional services. These are commuters type services to our neighboring counties, St. Johns, Nassau, and Clay counties. And we also provide transportation service for Clay County, and we'll start in Nassau County in this upcoming year. The success has been very successful for the JTA related to transit technology. We have a My JTA app where our passengers can use their phones to check schedules, buy tickets and board. And in August of 2023, to ensure equity of accessibility, we offer the use of Cash App to our customers, so the unbanked are able to also benefit from the MyJTA app. And further, we actually went to a best possible fares strategy, where if you are a single day pass or single ride pass purchaser, once you hit the multi-day thresholds of a 7-day or a 30-day pass, we automatically cap your rides for the remainder of the month to ensure that you're able to all of our citizens are able to benefit from the best fare, discounted fares for large purchasing of those fares. Next slide, please. So Move 2027 is our strategic plan, and it's mobility optimization through vision and excellence. And I can't stop saying that I believe I've got a great team here working in Jacksonville, from our frontline workers all the way up to the executive levels. They have an unwavering commitment to serving our customers every day. Our previous 5-year plan, Blueprint for Excellence, we finished it in 3 years, and that created the springboard for Move 2027. 7 strategic goals, placing emphasis on safety and security, financial responsibility, employee success, customer satisfaction, and very importantly, and you'll hear more about it, innovation. And that is our goal, to improve the quality of life in our community. Next slide. No greater task for the JTA than creating a safe environment for our community to flourish and grow. And one of those strategies is all around Vision Zero. Here in Florida, that is a challenge for many cities in Florida in terms of reducing fatalities and severe injuries related to pedestrian and bicycle and automobile accidents. And that is part of our strategic plan. As I mentioned earlier, we started out as an expressway authority, and our proudness has been to deliver infrastructure projects on time and on budget. In 2014, we received a local option gas tax extension, which gave us 27 mobility projects in our community, roadway, sidewalk, trail type projects. I'm happy to report we're completing that project list 2 years ahead of schedule this November. Because of this success, in 2021, we further extended and expanded the gas tax here, giving us an additional $500 million in infrastructure projects. Since the inception of our Mobility Works program, we've installed over 25 miles of sidewalks, 18 miles of bike lanes, 5 miles of trails, 74 pedestrian signals, 295 ADA ramps, and 36 traffic signals. I get tired just talking about that, but it was all for the mobility of our community. $20 million in capital improvements for the St. Johns River Ferry. And as I mentioned earlier, $15.6 million notification yesterday for a second ferry that will be environmentally friendly. Most recently, as it relates to equity, major key upgrades in Northwest Jacksonville related to one of our most underserved communities, uplifting all of their bus stops, 111 bus stops in this corridor, and just as importantly, incorporating local artists in terms of the development of those bus shelters. We have a partnership with University of North Florida, and the benefit far beyond our public transportation and roadway improvements. We're putting people to work in our community in terms of these investments. Next slide, please. As a part of the recognition of being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we were recently fortunate to receive our largest grant in Jacksonville's history, a $147 million grant to complete what's called the Emerald Trail. The Emerald Trail is a very innovative project where we are knitting together a 30-mile network of bicycle and pedestrian trails encircling downtown Jacksonville. It will connect 14 historic neighborhoods, 18 schools, 3 hospitals, 2 colleges, and nearly 30 parks. We are so excited about the diversity of the projects that we do here, big and small, and the impact that they will have going into the future. Next slide. As CEO of the JTA, I've been fortunate to be able to deliver on a number of key projects over time, both capital and operational, but none has been as bold in my career as the ultimate urban circulator known as the U2C. It's our signature project. we will be deploying the first fully autonomous vehicle network for public transportation in the nation. Phase 1 will launch next summer, and it is a 3-mile at-grade service in our downtown core, powered by 14 autonomous vehicles. And I want all of you to join us on that date in June of 2025, because it will be historic in terms of mobility in our community, as well as for Florida and the rest of the nation. Phase 2 will see us transform that 2-mile elevated infrastructure of the Skyway into a roadway for autonomous vehicles. Right now, it's a monorail. We will convert it back to a roadway at elevation. And then phase 3 will see us extend this system into nearby neighborhoods, creating a 10-mile system connecting our medical, educational, residential, and businesses into greater reliability of our transit system. That garners greater support from our riders, as well as ensuring the safety of our system in terms of just safety of the operation. So state of good repair, that is one of the first principles related to our filter or triaging of actual priorities for all of the systems I work for, and particularly for the JTA. One thing that we found for the JTA, and I found this in San Francisco as well as here in Jacksonville, when we talk about mobility in a holistic standpoint versus one mode versus another, when you talk about it in its entirety, the JTA's local support in the form of multiple gas tax extensions and expansions is because we're not focused on one particular mode, we're focused on the spectrum of mobility. So you may never ride our public transportation system. However, you've seen the benefit in terms of that sidewalk or that bike lane that we built that your child is actually riding on. And so I have made this a very public perspective of mine, which is I think all boats get lifted when we speak about mobility and transportation from a holistic perspective, and not roads versus transit, transit versus biking, and things of that nature. And so we are very fortunate here at the JTA. Our state of good repair is probably much better than most. And I think some of the more innovative projects we have underway allows us to stretch those dollars that we do have to actually focus on the core, and then at the same time provide services that lean into the future for our community, and also creating jobs. The road jobs and projects that we have, again, while it may not be beneficial for you from a public transportation standpoint, it's beneficial to you from an economic, putting food on your plate for your family standpoint in terms of your engagement and support of the JTA. The Mayo Clinic effort, when we did that during the pandemic, moving 30,000 COVID-19 samples, for example, it garnered greater support for the JTA financially from our local stakeholders in the form of sales tax, gas tax, and also local funding in the form of grants from Florida DOT.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Terry Tao.
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentations. My question is for Zachary. You had this interesting statistic. You said that $1 in maintenance can prevent like $6 or so of deferred maintenance down the track. My question is, do current accounting practices allow you to actually see this saving within sort of budgetary cycles? Like, is there some way to accurately depreciate infrastructure assets so that if you do this maintenance now, it gets reflected in the balance sheet somehow?
I mean, I think in the most important sense, no. You can do that in terms of your picture of your whole program and the deferred maintenance cost of your entire program, sort of your your capital sheet, such as it is. But from a budgeting perspective at the state level, we can't do that. We have to have each side of the ledger equal out every year, and tax dollars have to, tax or bond dollars that year have to equal expenditures for that year. So in the most important sense, that is not the case. I think where that comes into play most critically is that Michigan and every state, virtually, has to go out to the market for bonds. And if we cannot demonstrate that we're managing our system in a fiscally prudent way, we will not do as well in the market. We won't get as much money for our bonds. So there is an incentive built into that financial structure to do this right. But yeah, it doesn't help us with our legislature.
Okay, thank you.
Francis Arnold.
Thank you. And maybe this is for Nat, but anyone else can chime in. In a conversation with one of our previous speakers, I was told that door-to-door solutions, which you are clearly implementing, were actually more cost-effective than many public transportation systems, and that an ideal world might be autonomous vehicles just picking up citizens and taking them where they want to go. Clearly, from public safety point of view and maybe user convenience, that's also extremely attractive. How do you prioritize buses versus your monorail system versus these door-to-door events? And what are the cost-benefit analyses that you do?
Right. So for every one of our modes, we do a cost per passenger and cost per hour analysis to actually, really determine what are the levels of service we provide in each of these modes. Our actual Ready Ride door-to-door service replaced a very inefficient what we used to call community trolleys or community connection type of service. That was about 10 or 12 years ago when I first arrived here in Jacksonville. And those were legacy type operations in the beaches area and some of the older neighborhoods that at one point were very robust from a workforce standpoint and now are primarily retirees. And so what we were finding is that, a cost per passenger was, north of $50 per passenger. Frankly, if you look at the course of a year, it might have been cheaper to buy them a car and actually provide the fuel to operate that vehicle over the course of a year. Some of these routes were carrying no more than a couple of dozen people a day, but they were symbolic from the time, from decades ago when these were very robust workforce neighborhoods. So we started migrating to the Ready Ride zones. We started out with 4 at first and found that we were able to provide, door-to-door service, not abandon these neighborhoods that needed to have some type of public transportation connectivity at a much lower price per passenger. In the beaches area, for example, symbolically, we had a beaches trolley that we operated every year, but there was a much smaller and I think much more elegant solution, which was beach buggies. This was a private operation that actually was doing with golf carts. They were actually providing connectivity to the restaurants, the bars, and the hotels, something that we couldn't do with a 40-foot bus. And so with that, we decided to do a sponsorship of beach buggies and purchase 2 ADA compliant, at that time, years ago, ADA compliant golf carts. We're providing a greater level of accessibility for literally pennies on the dollar than running that 40-foot bus that, frankly, you couldn't get a surfboard on. So, it's those types of
But why does it extend across the entire system? Where does that benefit stop? Because the claim was made that that's actually cheaper than all of the other modes of transport.
Yeah, it is cheaper, but I think, in the long run, until we can kind of balance out the actual sponsorship, private alternative service model with the fixed government-supported large mass transportation efforts, I think you have to have a portfolio of services. So we don't pit one against the other. In fact, we think those alternative services actually feed and support the bigger, larger bus operation that we provide, along with the Skyway. And with the Skyway, it's autonomous operation right now. It does not have, the largest cost driver is the driver in the seat. And so there is also that discussion related to the impacts on the unions across the country with autonomous as well as private operators. So we have to balance that out. We're very fortunate here in Florida that we've been able to make that migration to a portfolio of services, some conventional public transportation, others are subscriptions or sponsored services operated by nonprofits and privates. And then we have our Ready Ride zones that we contract out. So we have a myriad of service delivery options. We try to fit the right tool to the right problem.
Dr. Arnold, could I offer one perspective on your question? I would encourage us to think about costs and benefits, not just from the perspective of the user and the transit operator, but also the broader community. So imagine yourself at Little Caesars Arena just across town. If you adopt the model where, hundreds or thousands of autonomous shuttles are trying to drop people off in that one place, that area becomes unusable as a pedestrian-friendly streetscape. And right now, there's housing, there are restaurants, there's entertainment. There are people who want to use that public street space, for interaction. I think we see the consequence of these kinds of choices in Detroit and a lot of places. One shocking statistic is that 1/3 of the square footage of downtown Detroit where we are now is committed to parking, and that's largely due to underinvestment in public transit services. So you end up with these public spaces that are occupied by vehicles rather than people, and the entire community suffers. So I not to say I think cars are bad. I don't think cars are bad. I think cars are an incredible machine, but it has to be balanced against balanced with other ways of getting people where they need to be.
One more point I would like to add with that also is the equity issue too, which is not everyone at this juncture will have accessibility to some of these autonomous vehicles. And that's why we're trying to also balance that out as part of our transit portfolio. So it's properly priced so we have that accessibility throughout our community. And, we've done that in numerous instances with our existing fixed route bus service that some of our community members have not been able to benefit from those deeply discounted passes, for example, 7-day pass or 30-day pass. Why? Because those are the folks who are actually using tips to get their money together to take a trip in the morning and a trip back at home at night. And so we've, through technology, have now given them the same benefit that our more affluent customers are able to use. And we have to do that with all of our services.
That's needed around that. We actually have a funding opportunity in the joint office that we awarded about 10 projects to work on innovative business models around EV charging, because it is a relatively new market. And we know that EV charging is so dependent on utilization that we probably need to come up with some new business models, depending on whether it's a DC fast charger or a level 2 or even a level 1. Because we want to see that private investment, but what's on the table for private industry to get involved is that revenue stream. And so we see a lot of key players in the market now that are investing in kind of this national network, because if we do get to that 33 million electric vehicles on the road, they're going to need to charge places. Most of them are probably going to charge at home, but they're also going to want to top off when they're at the grocery store, or when they're, might be choosing hotels based on the availability of EV chargers at the hotel if they're doing a road trip with their EV. So that there are a lot of new business models, but I think we also have a ways to go in innovating. And I think up until this kind of government catalyst of funding, $7.5 billion, but then that's also paired with the EV sales goals from the president of 50% EV sales by 2030, as well as some of the tax incentives for people to choose electric vehicles when they buy it, not only for new cars, but now also for used cars. We're going to really see a need for EV charging. And so I think that's really what's on the table, is for private industry to step into a new ecosystem where they can make some revenue.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Kathy Sullivan.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for your presentations. This entire day has been really fascinating. I think my question aims mainly at Nat. Can you say a little bit more about the infrastructure you're building throughout the 3 phases of the U2C? Clearly, the first phase, which we see in the picture behind you, is an elevated monorail. But what about the rest of it? Is it at grade? Is it intermixed with other vehicles? Maybe give us a little more detail there. And additionally, much of our discussion this morning with our other discussants focused on the kind of instrumentation and data that one needs about the installed infrastructure to make autonomous vehicles really effective and safe. So I'm curious, as you build out the U2C, what your thoughts are about both mapping in detail the infrastructure you're putting into place and or instrumenting the vehicles that we're moving through that infrastructure to continually collect additional data.
Okay. It was a little bit difficult to hear you, but I believe the question was, walk you through the different phases of the U2C, and then more importantly, what are some of the benefits and I guess data behind the support for the system. So right now, there are the origins of the actual U2C program came out of the 2.5-mile aerial structure that you see behind me, which is the Skyway, which was built in the 70s, and it was one of 3 innovative elevated automated people mover systems in the nation, funded by US DOT at that time. Might have been UMTA at that time. One was in Detroit, Jacksonville, and the other one was in Miami. The challenge we have is the actual support for the Skyway. It's now 30 years old. The original builders and the suppliers of the Skyway are no longer interested in supporting this technology. So we were left with a project that had a great deal of federal funding, local funding. It does cover the 2.5 miles, but not enough support for maintaining it in a safe fashion. And with the federal investment, again, have to keep it to the end of its useful life. And there's still about 2 decades with the existing structure. Because we're road builders, as we saw this dilemma, we really looked at, and it was originally designed to, it was originally planned for a full 10-mile system. They got to about 2.5 miles before my tenure and decided not to go any further. We put together a Skyway Advisory Committee of stakeholders, both supporters as well as detractors to the Skyway. They came to a unanimous conclusion that we needed the downtown mobility when expanded. A 10-mile monorail system that's obsolete today and expanding it going into the future was not, I think, a prudent use of taxpayer dollars. Because we're road builders, at the same time, we were hearing about the new technologies around autonomous vehicles. And as we were building roadway infrastructure and traffic signaling and things of that nature, we had to incorporate new technology in those cabinets. And the strategy then became, what if we were able to operate vehicles at street level, the 8 miles or so at street level, at grade level, and then through a series of spirals, ramps, which we build, spirals or ramps, which we have experience with, or elevators in the very extreme sense, get those autonomous vehicles up to the elevated structure. As I mentioned, it's an automated people mover. It does not have an operator at this point. However, we can't operate the monorail vehicles at street level. This was a more cost-efficient strategy and more future-proof strategy as it relates to downtown mobility. And our downtown is growing by the seams. We've got 17,000 new residents. I think we're number 2 in the nation in terms of growth and migration in terms of from other parts of the country. So that was kind of the framework and got us into it. Phase 1 at grade, 3 miles connecting to the east of our downtown core. Phase 2 is a conversion of the Skyway, very, very complicated lift. We're going through preliminary design and engineering at this point. And then phase 3 is in extensions into the adjoining neighborhoods, completing the 10-mile system and leveraging that federal investment and local investment in the existing aerial structure. The actual cost benefit for us is more in line with economic development and real estate development in our downtown core. We, similar to what was mentioned in terms of parking, we have a significant amount of parking in downtown Jacksonville. Going into the future, we do not see that as a prudent use of real estate in downtown. So we are now building a significant amount of residential and retail in our downtown core. And the idea is to build a transportation network that will move people very quickly. We're looking at 5 to 7 minute headways in downtown. You don't need a schedule. You walk out, these autonomous vehicles are able to pick you up and take you to your next destination. And one fact, in every one of my vehicles, the largest cost is 65% dedicated to the driver. We do respect our drivers. We will train them to take on other jobs. But in this particular case, we are able to provide a great deal more public transportation at a much lower cost and leverage these new technologies. And we're not trying to go door to door. That's not our plan. Our plan is fixed loops as it relates to and leveraging this aerial structure. So a great deal. I mean, I started out about 6 inches taller and a lot more hair on my head when we started this project, but it's well worth it because we do see this as a blueprint for other municipalities around the country. And the recent hold-on investment of building and manufacturing vehicles in this community will far outweigh our initial investment for the 10-mile system. They're starting out with $100 million for the manufacturing plant. And then, you know, all of the vehicles they sell across the nation and export back to Europe, as well as to the Middle East, the Jacksonville community will benefit from their profitability.
Great, thank you.
Sorry for the long-winded answer. I could do a lecture on just this, you know, what we've gone through with the U2C program.
It was fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's go to Steve Pacala.
Yeah, so I have questions about the primary impediments to the deployment of energy and electrical transportation infrastructure. So first to Rachel and Nat, I was part of a group that tried to look at the greatest impediments. And the difficulty with electrifying a city is that you've got to dig up all the streets to put electricity in and maybe to take the gas out, right? And so this is very expensive. And the question is, do you know of any city that has a plan to do this on a rotation that they're implementing so that you could, for instance, reach President Biden's goals in a timely way? And in particular, Nat, does your city have that plan? And then to Zachary, the same group looked at the primary impediments for deploying renewable infrastructure in rural areas as opposed to urban. And there it was community opposition that was the primary driver. And in a few communities, in particular, well, nationwide, communities like community solar, but not commercial, because revenues flow back into the community. And where there is commercial deployment that is supported, for instance, in rural Minnesota, if you tax commercial wind farms at a corporate rate, but it goes back into local coffers, some of these communities now have 80% of their tax revenue from that source. And that pays for band uniforms. And as long as they can tag what people are getting to the deployment, there's widespread support. Do you have anything like that going on in Michigan? So, yeah, take it in any order you want.
I'd be happy to go first. So the Charging, Fueling, Infrastructure program, which I said has $1.1 billion that were recently awarded. The Federal Highway Administration is just getting those contracts underway. So the actual installation of those chargers in cities hasn't started yet, but the planning has started. So I think we will see a lot more movement on how that aligns with kind of the urban planning and city planning foundation as we go forward. The one thing I will say is that an example of ways that cities have been thinking of innovative ways to deploy chargers, maybe without doing some of the trenching, is actually the city of Mesa, who did win a CFI award. And they are installing solar paneled battery backup level 2 chargers in their stations. And they are expecting to get those in relatively quickly because they also don't have to do that coordination with the utility and pull from the grid. So I do think that there are some solutions and innovation that don't require all of that trenching, but it is important to make sure that the CFI awardees are speaking to their city planners and their urban planners about how to not retrench the same road multiple times.
Very quickly, interesting statistic that we shared the other day with S&P. In the Northeast Florida area, only 1.7% of our citizens or registered vehicles are EVs. And in our community, there is not as an aggressive push towards electric vehicles. And that is also, I think, our publicly owned energy provider, JEA, right at this juncture, it's not a priority for them in terms of EV installations. We, along with our TPO in this area, we are advancing that in terms of all of our facilities as we are building new park and ride facilities and new road projects. We're putting that type of infrastructure in place. But just from a community standpoint, there's not been a great urgency to go in that direction. All of our autonomous vehicles, obviously, they will be electric, and we're looking at probably a fleet of 100 to 125 vehicles fully built out. And as it relates to our bus fleet, we do have a number of EVs that we have, out of our bus fleet. One of the challenges we have here in Jacksonville or in Duval County, I have a 870-mile service area. And so when we look very basically at kind of the cost of operation, it's at this juncture, it looks like a 1-for-2 swap in terms of actual vehicles because of range issues. We operate primarily a CNG fleet, so we've made strides in terms of moving towards a zero-emission fleet, but it'd probably be a longer horizon for our overall conversion as well as for the rest of our community to adopt those alternate zero-emission type of platforms. We are also looking at hydrogen fuel cell because of that, in terms of the technology maturing a little bit more before we make that actual final decision and make the capital investment to support zero emissions, the larger capital investment.
We actually have a few different tools to incentivize local communities to support and not just tolerate clean energy investment. One I already mentioned, but I didn't get into it all, is our Renewable Ready Communities program. And this essentially functions like a one-time reward to a community for successfully bringing a energy generating facility online. Provides up to $5,000 per megawatt to the community as sort of a one-time reward for siting. And in situations where the host of the project and the permitting entity are different, the award is split down to $2,500 per megawatt. So that's a one-time bonus. In addition to that, yes, normal personal property taxes apply to solar property. One major caveat to that is that solar facility owners have successfully challenged assessments of the value of those properties at the State Tax Commission, and that has actually galvanized opposition to solar projects in Michigan. So communities that thought their libraries, for example, were funded by the personal property taxes found that they were suddenly dealing with a shortfall when they lost their that appeal. So that issue has been at least partially addressed through the creation of what is called a solar PILT, payment in lieu of taxation, where a community can essentially waive the right to collect personal property tax in exchange for collecting a payment for every megawatt of energy generated from that facility. And what that does is it ensures the community a steady stream of payments over the life of the facility rather than something that can be challenged and potentially undercut at a later date.
Can I follow up on that? Because that was my question. I was driving through Michigan, across Michigan through the middle of the mitten, and came across 20 miles by 20 miles of windmills, which I hadn't appreciated before, all on family farms. So is this an example of what you're talking about? What I'd love to know is who built these, who operates them, who benefits? And what were the challenges in implementing those? Was it similar to what you said for the solar?
Without knowing anything specific about that project, if there is an already installed wind farm anywhere in Michigan, it was built prior to the passage of our new clean energy laws. But I think your basic observation that the installation of energy generating technology on farms is a key diversifier for farm businesses. In Michigan and around the country, we've seen consolidation of ownership in the agricultural industry and the loss of family farms, and the ability to generate revenue from as a site host provides a key opportunity for those farms to
So you're saying the farmer, so this was actually 20 miles by 20 miles. It must have been 100 different farms.
Sure.
But all the same windmills. So this
Okay.
wasn't a company project that convinced all these farmers to do it. You think it was individual farmers who built them?
Well, again, I don't know a lot about that. I don't know anything about that specific project. I'm just making an observation that agricultural businesses can benefit from diversification. In the case of what sounds like a utility scale, site, it may be the case that the developer simply purchased farmland or otherwise or land from other sources and turn that into a property development. It's not clear to me, just based on the information that you gave.
Francis, we studied this a lot in a National Academy study, and in most of the country where you see these massive wind farms over agricultural regions, it's a relationship between a developer and individual farmers or ranchers, and the individual farmers or ranchers get revenue, right? They share in the revenue produced by these beasts. So it's a new source of revenue, as Zachary is saying, but also in a lot of places, they're taxed at a corporate rather than an agricultural rate. And so if those taxes go back into the local infrastructure, it's a much bigger boost, right, for everybody, not just the person whose farm it's located on.
Well, we're talking about the relationship between agriculture and energy. I just wanted to make one other observation, which is that notwithstanding the fact that farmers can obtain other sources of revenue to keep their businesses open, solar as a use case is not completely incompatible with agriculture or agricultural use cases, right? So we are seeing dramatic improvements in agrovoltaics, which basically allow that land to continue to be used for growth of crops, and of course, a farmer can use that land, or at least part of that land, for livestock as well. In many cases, the vegetation that grows up around solar panels is useful feed stock for goats and the like. So if you actually go to, there are farms or solar farms in Michigan where you can meet the goats that maintain the grounds, and they are a key part of the team.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Vicky Sato.
Thank you. Rachel, I have a question for you just about what drives the strategy of the agency. So I've been reading that there's been a bit of a downturn, for example, in the sale of electronic vehicles after an early incentive-driven rise. So as you think about investment in infrastructure versus investment in the things the infrastructure is for, how do you view the power, if you will, of infrastructure? Do you see this, as you keep building infrastructure, can you reinstill energy, for example, in that EV economic base? Or do you view your approach as being more responsive to the user demand?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the answer is actually a little bit of both. So in part, why infrastructure is so important and why there is public investment in it is because EV sales and a lot of EV drivers and the automakers were telling us that infrastructure is a problem. Like, we need to get this solved. We need people to know where they're going to be able to charge before they get their vehicles. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. One of the greatest things that I've seen, though, since the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, since all the automakers have made commitments to making electric vehicles into the future, is that I think we've actually got past that conversation a little bit. I actually heard the president of GM on stage a couple of weeks ago at a Center for Automotive Research conference say, the infrastructure is coming, and then moved on to the next thing, which, automakers typically don't say that. They continue to say, we need the investments, we need the public support. So I think it's actually a really big win that we have gotten to a place where we can author things like the decarbonization blueprint and have a strategy across all of the government agencies. So it's a really whole of government approach to support the EV market. I do think that those tax incentives are still important to drive sales. And while we have seen some negative press, I do think it's been a little bit misleading. EV sales really grew in this administration, and we knew that we couldn't be on that exponential trajectory forever, right? And I think actually what has happened has been EV sales haven't declined, they just haven't continued to grow at that exponential rate. So we're still seeing about 10% new EV sales. So a very strong early market, but we do need these charging solutions to show up. The 1.2 million public charging ports are really needed to support those 33 million electric vehicles. And we need it to show up where people find it convenient to charge, whether that's helping multi-unit dwelling folks find charging nearby, whether that's, people that can install chargers in their homes. There needs to be a lot of solutions, but I think people need to start seeing the EV chargers in order to feel comfortable to purchase an EV next, whether that's a new EV or a used EV. And both those tax credits are for both of those segments, both the new market and the used market. So I think we are actually progressing in a very positive strategic direction. We've put it in writing what the strategy is. We have a lot of private agreement that we're headed in that direction. So I think we've, at least for now, solved a little bit of the chicken and egg problem while we try to support the EV market in sales as well as the infrastructure to support it.
All right, Francis?
Just a quick question. Would you talk a little bit about reliability of these chargers?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is one of the really critical pieces of the Joint Office strategy in particular. So we're really an organization that is here to support the $7.5 billion going to EV charging through things like technical assistance. We actually have a team specifically on standards and reliability because we know that the current EV charging network is not as reliable as we need it to be to convince people to drive electric. So we actually have stated in the minimum standards, which is a rulemaking by the Federal Highway Administration that applies to all of that $7.5 billion going in, that you need to demonstrate at least 97% uptime of the stations. With that, we are also working directly with industry through a consortium, a lab consortium called ChargeX, to help solve some of the problems that we are seeing in the early EV charging network market. Things like common error codes, solving some of the issues that we know is kind of plaguing the industry right now. So our goal is to get upwards of 97% reliability. I think the industry also supports that because they also want to see an EV charging market that's a very great customer experience, because they want their chargers to be used and they want their electric vehicles to be purchased. So I think we actually all have a very common goal here. And it is a key piece of software and hardware development in the Joint Office in collaboration with industry.
I want to make one other observation here. Why are we building the nationwide charging network? Why are we investing here in Michigan in chargers? I think most people would say, oh, because we care about the climate, and that's part of the answer. But fundamentally, and I think people will understand this more and more every year, Michiganders deserve access to the best vehicle technology in the world. Americans deserve access to the best vehicle technology in the world. And Europe is giving Europeans access to that technology through their charging network. China is giving Chinese folks access through their charging network. It would be a shame if Americans didn't have the ability to access a piece of technology that converts energy into propulsion much more efficiently than the existing technology, that does not pollute the air that it drives through in real time, and does not involve moving pieces that consistently break over the life of a vehicle. And so these are key product improvements that Americans deserve access to, and this infrastructure law is helping provide access.
Bravo. Paula Hammond.
Yes, I actually have a question for both Zach and Nat, and it's related to the really integrated mobility infrastructure that you have in Jacksonville. For Nat, I was wondering if that has changed people's behavior in terms of how many cars you see going into the city, how many people own cars, or you know, how the usage rate of the transportation. And for Zachary, I was going to ask what kinds of things would enable a city like Detroit to have this kind of mobility? What are the enablers and what are the things that are limitations? And I'll say this as a homegrown Detroiter, that you could never get around the city without a car. It's unthinkable. How could that be transformed into something that may be present in Jacksonville?
All right. Okay, well, I'll try and kick us off. It's very interesting because this is not a very transit supportive type of environment here in Jacksonville. In fact, you know, I think my predecessors did a very good job with the expressway roadway origins of the JTA of the past, because we have very wide roads and boulevards, and one of the challenges we have because of that is a high pedestrian fatality rate compared to other communities. So we've been very instrumental in terms of that infrastructure. But as it relates to transit, what we're seeing is we're seeing a growth in our ridership, but I think it's still our core ridership that may have fallen off prior to the pandemic, and now they're coming back. But in these alternative services, that's where we're seeing exponential growth. So when we talk about the microtransit type trips, our original plan was that microtransit would then feed into our fixed route bus service. And in our climate, you know, with 90-degree weather, no one's going to walk a mile to get to a bus stop to get to fixed route service. What we're seeing is not as much of a transition to using our microtransit to get to a bus stop. We're seeing a lot more localized trips. And I don't know how much of that is due to post-pandemic behaviors where now folks are working more remotely. So we're still trying to kind of manage that. We're going through our survey right now to really manage who are our riders, where they're going, purpose of their trips. But a majority of some of those microtransit trips in those ready ride zones, majority of those trips are people going to the grocery store, or they're going to take care of some other type of short trip within their community. So we are now looking at totally migrating our transit network to be more hub-based, or with transportation nodes that are decentralized from our core operation and focus more on very large nodes with multiple routes connecting to them, and then a distribution scheme that will initially use manned vehicles and then eventually be that autonomous shuttle type of vehicle that will help us lower the cost in terms of the actual operation. But it's mobility within nodes that we're starting to see as more of a pattern versus that historical commute pattern in the morning and in the evening during rush hours. It's more leveled out through the course of the day, and transit riders are still transit riders, and we are, though, tapping into the short trip in a specific community, neighborhood.
Okay, our last question here.
Oh, I think.
Kath-
Sorry, I was
There's a
going to answer her
follow-up?
question.
Oh, okay.
There was a question about Detroit or about Michigan specifically. So, there are a lot of different funding models for how a region like the Detroit region could build transit. And, a tragedy of the last 4 decades is that Detroit has decided to select essentially none of those models. So we do not have a self-sustaining system for building new or really, adding capacity to the regional transit system around here. The Detroit and surrounding communities are essentially completely reliant on pass-through from the state's comprehensive transportation fund, which is not really adequate to build an urban transportation system. So, that's sort of the fundamental problem, or that is the sort of factual problem. I don't know if that's the fundamental problem. Detroit region voters very narrowly rejected a revenue proposal in 2016 that would have funded the Regional Transit Authority. I think that a new version of that would be a step in the right direction to revitalize local transit. I think part of the solution could be that the state legislature recognize that regional transit solutions for all of our major urban areas are a priority for growing the state, and that without them, we will have a hard time attracting and retaining young residents who are necessary to grow our tax base. So this is not really just a local policy issue anymore, it's also a statewide policy issue. And the last observation I would make is that in the late 1970s, and this happened in a few places, but I think it happened in Michigan more than basically anywhere else in the country, the Michigan voters decided to, at the state level, decided to hamstring Michigan voters at the local level and prevent them from enacting certain kinds of revenue measures that could have funded infrastructure upgrades. Those are known locally as the Headley Amendments, and they restrain local ability to institute sales taxes. I don't know about Florida specifically, but I know Austin, for example, funds its transportation system based on sales taxes, and many successful southern cities do that. That is not an option right now in Michigan. So there are things that we could do, policy changes that we could make to return power to local voters to make investments in themselves. And that's something that we could look at here in Michigan.
Thank you. Okay, our last question from Kathy Wotecki, and we're almost at time, so please make the answers efficient if you could.
Sure. And this is more an observation than a question, Maria. Frances earlier, I think, had asked about the wind farms that she saw driving around Michigan. And as we've been meeting, the Economic Research Service at USDA just posted a new analysis of the Census of Agriculture saying that about 8% of farms and ranches have renewable energy systems. And they range from very small scale ones like rooftop solar to the large scale wind turbine farms that you saw, as well as methane digesters on big livestock facilities. And also, I just wanted to underscore it's been great that we've had community leaders on transportation as part of this, because the progress that's been made, particularly in states like Iowa, where 62% of the energy that's generated in the state is coming from wind power, has been really thoughtful local legislation that really provided the incentive for the kind of business relationships that Steve Pacala described between the wind turbine companies and farmers. So back in the 1980s, Iowa passed state legislation requiring that energy producers purchase wind power. And that percentage, has ramped up over time. So it's been a real combination of local incentives and having the technology available and time. The thing that's really disappointing, though, is that this 8% of farms and ranches with renewable energy systems is only up 1 percentage point from 5 years ago, the last time that this survey was done. So a lot of opportunity, I think, for further generation from rural areas of renewable energy.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy. Obviously, a lot of headroom on this for future progress. So, what an amazing session this has been. Rachel, Zach, and Nat, thank you so much, both for your presentations, but also for the insights that you have added to our discussion. You've certainly come a long way in educating us and our listeners on this important issue of infrastructure. So we're going to take a break now, and we'll be back at 2:25. And during our lunch here, the PCAST members are going to be fortunate to be able to have a tour of this amazing Michigan Central new lab facility that we are very excited about. But we will see you all back here at 2:25. So see you then.